Welcome back, Legends. You're at Vision Harry. Another incredible story awaits. Molly Weasley arrived at the Dursleys with a DMLE warrant. She left with Harry before dawn. Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1, The Warrant. The letter came back unopened. That was the thing that did it. Not the rumors, not the carefully worded nothing that Dumbledore said whenever she asked, not even the look on Ron's face when he described Harry's bedroom to her, that small, bare room with the cat flap on the door and the padlock on the outside. She'd filed all of those things away in the part of herself that she'd been trying very hard not to listen to. Because Albus Dumbledore was a wise man. Because there were reasons she didn't understand. Because Harry Potter was safe, and the alternative was too awful to sit with. But the letter came back unopened, and that was the thing that did it. She'd sent it 3 weeks ago. A simple letter: "How are you, dear? We hope you're eating well, Ron misses you, there's a place at our table whenever you want it," the kind of letter she sent to all of her children when they were away, because that was what you did. You wrote. You reminded them they were loved. You made sure the thread stayed taut. It came back to her on a Tuesday morning, still sealed, with a stamp on the envelope she didn't recognize. She'd turned it over twice before she understood what she was looking at. Return to sender, recipient may not receive correspondence. Not address unknown. Not recipient not at this location. The letter had reached number 4, Privet Drive perfectly well. Someone had decided Harry Potter was not allowed to read it. Molly Weasley put the letter down on the kitchen table. She smoothed it flat with both hands, very carefully, the way she smoothed things when she needed a moment before she spoke or acted or said something she couldn't take back. Then she went to find Arthur. He was in his shed, which was where Arthur went when he was worried about something and needed to pretend he was doing something productive. She could tell from the doorway that he hadn't actually touched any of his Muggle artifacts. They were all in exactly the positions she'd seen them in last Tuesday, which meant he'd been standing in here thinking for a week and hadn't told her. "Arthur," she said. He turned around, and she saw it immediately, the particular tightness around his eyes that meant he already knew whatever she was about to say, and had been hoping she wouldn't say it. "Show me," she said. "Molly, don't." Her voice was very quiet. That was how Arthur knew she was serious. When Molly got loud, it was ordinary anger, frustration, tiredness, the ordinary friction of a busy household. When she got quiet, it was something else entirely. "Whatever you've been standing in this shed thinking about for a week, Arthur. Show me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his robes and produced a folded piece of parchment. She recognized the ministry header before she'd finished unfolding it. The seal at the bottom was from the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad, which was a department she'd had occasion to deal with twice in the early years of the twins' childhood, and both times it had been about property damage rather than anything serious. But this wasn't a standard reversal notice. It was a welfare flag. The language was bureaucratic and careful, the way ministry language always was when it was trying to say something alarming without technically saying it. But Molly had been reading ministry documents since she was 19 years old, and she knew how to find the thing hiding inside the careful language. Incident report: underage magic, Smelting's residence, Little Whinging, Surrey. Date: August 2nd. Nature of incident: accidental confectionery-based levitation, attributed to distress response. Minor involved: Potter, Harry James, D.O.B., July 31, 1980. Post-incident assessment conducted by AMRS Field Agent Whitmore, who noted the following environmental observations at the incident location and files this supplementary welfare notation per Standing Order 7 of the Child Magical Welfare Act 1973. The next paragraph was 6 lines long. Molly read it twice. She folded the parchment back up along its original creases. She handed it back to Arthur. "How long have you had this?" she asked. 4 days. "And you didn't tell me because I knew what you'd do," he said, "and I wanted to think first. I didn't want you going in there without, Arthur." She looked at him steadily. A welfare flag from the AMRS means a field agent walked into that house and saw something bad enough that they felt they needed to report it. They don't file supplementary welfare notations because a child seems a bit peaky. They file them when they see something. She paused. Combined with my letter coming back with a return to sender stamp on it. Arthur's expression shifted. Your letter came back. This morning. She watched him process that. Someone in that house decided Harry Potter was not allowed to receive correspondence. That's not a household that's merely difficult or unwelcoming, Arthur. That's a household that's actively restricting him. She kept her voice very even. I want to go to Amelia Bones. Molly, I want a warrant. Dumbledore, I am not asking Dumbledore. The evenness cracked, just slightly, around the edges. I have been deferring to Dumbledore on the subject of Harry Potter since he was 15 months old, and so has everyone else in the wizarding world, and I am done with it. This is a child. This is a specific child who I have met, in my home, who ate at my table and looked at my family like he was seeing something he didn't know existed, and I am not going to keep deferring while someone returns his letters and a ministry agent files welfare notations that sit in someone's in-tray for 4 days. She breathed. I am going to Amelia. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way that meant I knew this was coming and I'm with you. I'll come with you, he said. No, she said. You'll stay here and you'll find out everything you can about Standing Order 7 and what protections it affords. And you'll do it quietly, so that when I come back with something actionable, we know exactly what to do with it. She was already moving back toward the house. And Arthur, if Dumbledore contacts you before I'm back, you don't know where I've gone. Where will I say you've gone? Shopping, she said, and the door swung shut behind her. The Ministry of Magic at 7 in the morning had a different quality to it than the Ministry at any other time. The atrium was quieter, the golden light still warming up, the queues at the security desk short enough that Molly was through in under 3 minutes and already stepping into the lift before she'd finished straightening her robes. She'd worn her good robes. The deep burgundy ones that she'd bought for Percy's prefect celebration and had since worn to every official occasion that required her to look like a woman who could not be easily dismissed. She'd also worn her hair up, which she almost never did, because it made her look severe and she'd spent most of her adult life deliberately not looking severe in case it frightened the children. She was not currently concerned about frightening anyone. The DMLE occupied the second level, and Amelia Bones's office was at the far end of a corridor lined with filing cabinets so tall that their tops vanished into a permanent institutional shadow. The assistant outside Amelia's door was a young witch with reading glasses and an expression of mild preemptive regret, the look of someone who spent their days informing people that Director Bones did not see visitors without appointments. I'm Molly Weasley, Molly said pleasantly. Arthur Weasley's wife, he's in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office. I don't have an appointment, but I have a welfare flag issued 4 days ago by AMRS Field Agent Whitmore regarding Harry Potter, and I'd like Director Bones to see it before it gets buried in the same in-tray it's apparently been sitting in since Thursday. She smiled. I'm happy to wait if she's with someone. The assistant blinked. Then she stood up and went through the inner door without saying anything, which Molly took as a good sign. She sat down in one of the visitors' chairs and folded her hands in her lap and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Amelia Bones was a broad-shouldered woman with a monocle and the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years in a profession that attracted both dedicated public servants and spectacular corruption, and had emerged from the experience with her integrity so thoroughly intact that it had calcified into something almost architectural. She was not warm, precisely, but she was direct in a way that Molly found enormously refreshing after a morning spent thinking about careful men with long beards and longer justifications. Mrs. Weasley, she said, settling behind her desk. You mentioned the Potter welfare flag. I have a copy, Molly said, producing her own. Arthur received his 4 days ago. I suspect it was routed to him because Harry is a friend of our son's, and whoever processed it thought it might be handled quietly that way. Family to family. Amelia looked at the document. Her expression didn't change much, She was clearly a woman who trained herself not to let her face do things in professional contexts, but something in the set of her jaw shifted. Whitmore filed this himself, outside the standard incident chain. He added the welfare notation under his own authority. Yes, Molly said. Which tells me he saw something significant enough that he wasn't confident it would reach the right desk if he sent it up the standard chain. Amelia looked up at her over the monocle. I'm not here to be political about this, Molly said. I'm not interested in Dumbledore's reasons, I'm not interested in the blood ward arguments, I'm not interested in the greater good considerations. I am a witch who has met this specific child and I am telling you that the child is in trouble, and this, she tapped the parchment, is a ministry document that says the same thing. She reached into her bag and produced the returned letter, setting it on the desk. This is a letter I sent him 3 weeks ago. It was returned this morning. Someone in that household stamped it returned to sender, recipient may not receive correspondence. A child. A minor child. Not receiving correspondence. Amelia picked up the returned envelope and examined it with the thoroughness of someone evaluating evidence, which was exactly what she was doing. Agent Whitmore noted in his supplementary notation, Molly continued, that the child appeared underweight, that his clothing was inadequate and too large to have been fitted to him, that there was a room in the house, she had the phrasing memorized, consistent with previous habitation by the minor, featuring a small cot, a broken toy soldier, and a child's drawings on the wall, access to which was blocked by a bolted exterior panel, suggesting the minor had previously been housed in this location despite it being a storage space of approximately 40 square feet. Silence. That's a cupboard, Molly said. He lived in a cupboard. And now he's in a room with a cat flap on the door. She kept her voice level through an act of will that she would not think about until later, when she was home and the children were in bed. I want a welfare warrant under the Child Magical Welfare Act. I want it today. And I want to execute it myself. Amelia set down the envelope. She looked at Molly with the particular expression of a senior official trying to determine whether the person across the desk was a useful ally or a liability, and Molly met the look steadily and let her look. You understand, Amelia said, that executing a warrant of this nature against the household of Harry Potter, given his status and his guardianship arrangement, is going to create significant institutional turbulence. Yes, Molly said. And you understand that Dumbledore is likely to push back. Yes. And that the blood ward question is genuinely complicated from a magical protection standpoint, and some people are going to raise it. People can raise whatever they like, Molly said. The Child Magical Welfare Act does not contain an exemption for blood wards. It does not contain an exemption for the greater good. It contains one relevant provision, which is that no minor magical citizen shall be housed in conditions that constitute neglect or abuse. That provision doesn't have footnotes. Amelia Bones looked at her for another long moment. Then, slowly, she almost smiled. No, she said. It doesn't. She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her. There are 3 categories of warrant applicable here. Standard welfare assessment, emergency removal, and, she paused, pulling open a drawer, what we call in this office a full DMLE warrant, which combines welfare assessment powers with a formal investigation authority, meaning that anything discovered during the visit can be used in subsequent proceedings without a separate evidential warrant. She set a stamp on the desk that looked older than the building. The 3rd category requires my personal authorization and a countersignature from a senior auror. It also requires documented evidence of reasonable cause. She tapped Whitmore's report. I'd call this documented evidence of reasonable cause. So would I, Molly said. Amelia was already writing. I'm going to need you to make a formal statement before I issue this. Everything you've told me, the returned letter, the welfare flag, your personal observations of the child's behavior and presentation on the occasions you've met him. All of it on record. Of course. And when you execute this warrant, Amelia looked up again, you will be acting as an authorized welfare agent of the DMLE. Do you understand what that means? It means, Molly said, that I am going in there with the full authority of this department behind me, and that anyone who obstructs me is obstructing a legal action of the Ministry of Magic. Precisely. Amelia held her gaze. It also means you go in there and you do this properly. You document everything. You don't let your anger run ahead of the process, because if you do, they'll use it to muddy the evidence. A pause. Can you do that? Molly thought about the letter on the desk. The stamp. Recipient may not receive correspondence. She thought about Ron saying, he didn't know you could ask to use the loo, at flourish and blots, and her having to smile and nod and file it away. Yes, she said. I can do that. Amelia nodded once, crisply, and began drafting the warrant. The statement took an hour. The counter-signature, from a senior orer named Proudfoot, who read the Whitmore report with a face like weathered stone and signed without comment, took another 15 minutes. The warrant itself, when Amelia pressed the DMLE seal into the wax at the bottom, looked like what it was, an official document that gave Molly Weasley the legal authority to walk into number 4, Privet Drive and take stock of the situation with the full weight of the magical government behind her. She held it carefully on her way back through the ministry. It was 3 sheets of parchment, folded in thirds, sealed with burgundy wax. It was not a dramatic object. It looked like a bill or a planning notice or any other piece of official correspondence. But she was aware, holding it, of the precise shape of the thing she'd just done. She'd gone around Dumbledore. That thought would have been unthinkable a year ago. Not because she was afraid of him, exactly, she was not a woman who was easily frightened, but because she had trusted him the way you trusted the institution of a thing, the way you trusted that the school your children attended was managed by someone who knew what they were doing. That trust was still there, somewhere, but it had developed a fracture this morning while she sat in Amelia Bones's office and heard herself reciting the words 40 square feet and cat flap and underweight in the voice of a woman giving a formal statement, and she hadn't been able to fix it. Maybe she didn't want to fix it. She stepped out of the ministry into the late morning, blinking in the summer light, and she thought about what Arthur had said. I knew what you'd do. Yes, she thought. You did. And you let me do it anyway. That was why she'd been married to Arthur Weasley for 22 years, and why she intended to be married to him for another 50, which was an actuarially unlikely but not magically impossible goal. She went home, kissed Arthur, told him to start pulling everything he could find on Standing Order 7, ate half a sandwich because she'd forgotten about breakfast, and then sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the warrant in front of her and started planning. She was going to go alone. She'd known that from the beginning, some instinct she couldn't fully articulate. Not because she was worried about being outnumbered, she was not, but because of what it meant for Harry. If she arrived with Arthur and maybe an Auror or two, it became a formal operation, large and official and frightening in the way that large official things were frightening to 11-year-old boys who had spent their whole lives being small and peripheral. She wanted Harry to see her. A person. Someone he knew. Someone who came specifically for him. She went through every scenario she could think of. The Dursleys turning her away at the door, the warrant made that impossible. Obstruction of a DMLE action was a serious offense and she was prepared to say so clearly. Dumbledore appearing, possible, but she was going at night, and Dumbledore's network of informants was thorough but not instantaneous. Harry not wanting to leave, she sat with that one for a while, because it was the one that actually worried her. Not because she thought he'd choose to stay, but because he might not believe he was allowed to leave. That was different and required different handling. She thought about what Ron had told her, without entirely meaning to, over the course of the previous school year. Small things, collected and stored. Harry sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs until he got his Hogwarts letter. Harry not knowing magic was real until he was 11. Harry being told that his parents died in a car crash, which was so thoroughly, deliberately wrong that she couldn't think about it too long without her hands tightening around whatever she happened to be holding. Harry not knowing he could ask to use the loo. She was going at night. Before dawn, specifically, which had a practical logic, fewer muggles on the street, the Dursleys caught off balance, less time for anyone to alert anyone, but also felt, to Molly, like the right kind of symbolic timing. You rescued someone before dawn. You brought them out of the dark and into the morning. That was how these things were supposed to go. She set the warrant down and finished her tea. Then she went upstairs and started laying out Harry's things. Not his school things, those were locked up at Privet Drive, and she'd retrieve them when she went. But the things she could prepare. She cleared the camp bed in Ron's room and made it up properly with the good sheets, the ones that didn't have Chudley cannons printed on them, because Harry deserved sheets that were just sheets for once. She put a glass of water on the bedside table. She found the spare set of Weasley Christmas jumper weight fabric she kept for emergencies and made a note to size something for him because the boy was a shadow and she was going to feed him properly if it was the last thing she did. She did all of these things very carefully and methodically, because doing them gave her something to put her hands to, and because every careful action was a small argument against the version of events she'd spent a year telling herself wasn't true. He was fine. Dumbledore said he was safe. He was well cared for. She smoothed the good sheets over the camp bed in Ron's room. She tucked in the corners. He was fine. She went back downstairs to where Arthur was spreading ministry documents across the kitchen table with the quiet systematic energy of a man who was very good at research and very angry and was converting one into the other. Standing Order 7, he said, without looking up. It gives the DMLE the authority to remove a minor from a registered guardianship placement without prior notice if there is documented evidence of harm. But here's the thing, he tapped a line on one of the documents. The language specifically says without regard to protective enchantments or previously established magical agreements. Someone added that in 1978 and I think I know why, because that was right in the middle of the First War and there were cases of children being kept in warded locations as a form of control, so the blood wards aren't a barrier, Molly said. Legally, no. Magically, he took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Magically, it's more complicated. The blood ward is keyed to Lily's sacrifice and Petunia's acceptance of the boy. While Harry is in that house and considers it home, the wards hold. But the ward structure itself shouldn't impede a DMLE action, because the wards were never designed to keep the ministry out. They were designed to keep Voldemort's followers out. He paused on the name in the way he always did, a half-second skip. Dumbledore designed them himself, which means he knows exactly what they will and won't stop, and he knows they won't stop you. Good, Molly said. He's also going to know you went to Amelia. Someone in the ministry will have told him already, or will by morning. I know. Arthur looked at her. Molly. What are you going to do if he tries to stop you? She met his eyes. He won't. He might. If he thinks the blood wards, he can think whatever he likes about the blood wards. She pulled the warrant across the table and held it up. This is a DMLE warrant with Amelia Bones's seal on it. Dumbledore is the headmaster of Hogwarts. He has no legal authority to countermand a DMLE welfare action, and he knows it. He can object. He can argue. He can make his case. But he cannot physically stop me from executing this warrant, and if he tries, then the legal situation becomes significantly worse for him, because obstructing a DMLE action is a criminal offense and I will happily list his name on the incident report. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Right, he said, and he sounded, not worried exactly, but something else. Something a little odd, actually, which she found both touching and faintly irritating because she was simply being sensible. This was simply the obvious course of action, there was nothing particularly remarkable about it. I'm going tonight, she said. Around 3 in the morning. I want to be in and out before the street wakes up. You want me here? I want you here. And I want Percy not to know, he'll fret, and he'll want to be official about it, and I don't have the time. Twins don't know either. Ron, she thought about this, Ron can know when Harry's here. Not before. And Ginny? Molly almost smiled, just slightly. Ginny already knows. I don't know how, but she does. She came down at 11 o'clock last night and asked if Harry was going to be all right. Arthur looked at her with the expression of a man who had 4 sons and a daughter and was continually struck by how much sharper the daughter was than all 4 of them combined. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her he would be." Molly set the warrant back on the table. "And then I went to the ministry and made sure of it." At 2 in the morning, when the house was asleep and the summer dark pressed gently against the kitchen windows, Molly sat at the table one last time and read through the warrant from beginning to end. She had the AMRS welfare flag. She had her own statement, signed and sealed. She had Whitmore's supplementary notation with its careful bureaucratic language that said 40 square feet and exterior bolt. She had the returned letter. She had everything she needed. She also had, tucked into the inside pocket of her robes along with her wand, something that wasn't on any official document, a memory. Harry Potter at the Weasley table at Christmas, watching Fred and George throw food at each other with the expression of someone watching a magic trick, something so astonished and unguarded that she'd had to look away before she started crying. Harry Potter saying thank you for the Christmas jumper with a formality that broke your heart, because nobody had ever taught him the casual way of accepting gifts. Harry Potter following Ron through the burrow touching things very gently, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. She tucked that memory away behind the warrant and stood up and smoothed her robes. She left a note for Arthur, gone to Privet Drive. Back before breakfast. Don't worry. Then, because she knew Arthur, she added, I mean it about the not worrying. She walked to the end of the lane, where the Muggle houses gave way to the field, and she turned, and with the very particular pull of someone who knew exactly where she was going and was completely certain she would not be turned away, she disapparated. The night air of Little Whinging was warm and smelled of cut grass and car exhaust. Privet Drive was exactly as neat and aggressively ordinary as she'd imagined, identical houses, identical lawns, identical roses in identical beds, the kind of deliberate sameness that told you the people who lived here were very concerned with the opinion of the people who lived next door. Number 4. She walked up the path and stood on the doorstep and looked at the house for a moment. From here she could see the window of the smallest bedroom, the one above the kitchen, the one with the cat flap, she knew, because she'd read Whitmore's report 4 times by now. There was no light in it. Of course there was no light. It was 3 in the morning. She reached into her robes and took out her wand. Then she reached into the other inside pocket and took out the warrant. She knocked on the door. Not loudly. Not the way she knocked when she was furious. She knocked the way you knocked when you knew perfectly well that the door was going to open, because you had the legal authority of the Ministry of Magic behind you and the door knew it too, and there was simply no point in being theatrical about it. She waited. A light came on inside. She waited. She could hear movement, heavy, slow, irritated. She could hear someone saying something in a low, terse voice. She could hear another voice, higher and more anxious, answering. The lock turned. The door opened. Vernon Dursley stood in his doorway in a dressing gown, enormous and purple-faced and squinting at her with the expression of a man who had expected a wrong number and found something considerably more alarming. He looked at her robes. He looked at her wand, which she was holding loosely at her side because she wasn't threatening anyone, she was simply not concealing it. He looked at the warrant in her other hand. What, he started. Mr. Vernon Dursley. Molly said, in the voice that she used for this kind of occasion, the one that was perfectly pleasant and gave absolutely no quarter. My name is Molly Weasley. I am an authorized welfare agent of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, acting under a full DMLE warrant issued this morning under the authority of Director Amelia Bones. She held up the warrant so he could see the seal. I am here to conduct a welfare assessment of Harry James Potter, currently residing at this address as your legal ward. I have full legal authority to enter these premises, assess his living conditions, speak with him privately, and if I determine it to be necessary, remove him to a place of greater safety. She kept her voice pleasant throughout. I'd like to come in, please. Vernon Dursley stared at her. Behind him, she could see the hallway, clean, expensively furnished, a large framed photograph of a very pink child on the wall, a coat rack with 4 adult coats and no children's coats at all. "It's 3 in the morning," he said. "Yes," Molly agreed. "It is." He didn't move. She looked at him with complete, settled patience, and he looked at her, and the night sat between them, and she did not step back and she did not raise her voice and she did not in any way suggest that she found his opinion of the situation relevant. He stepped aside. She walked into the house. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking around with the careful, documenting attention of a woman who was going to remember everything she saw in this house and write it down the moment she had a moment to sit. The house was large. Prosperous, even. Clean. The kind of clean that came from effort and care. There was a smell of cooking in the air, something roasted, probably from dinner. The framed photos showed Vernon and Petunia Dursley in various cheerful locations, and a boy she assumed was Dudley at various ages, and there was a quality to the photos, the number of them, the frames, the careful arrangement, that spoke very clearly of a family that documented itself, that made a record of its own happiness, that existed very deliberately in its own story. There was not a single photograph that contained Harry Potter. Petunia Dursley was at the bottom of the stairs. She was thin and sharp-featured and she was looking at Molly with an expression that Molly could not quite read, not the bluster and aggression of her husband, but something warier, something that had underneath it a complicated emotion that Molly set aside for later analysis. "Mrs. Dursley," Molly said. "I'd like to see Harry's room, please." Petunia's expression shifted. "He's asleep." "I know," Molly said. "I'll wake him gently." A pause. "It's the..." Petunia stopped. "Second door on the left," she said. "At the top of the stairs." Molly looked at her steadily. "Not the cupboard under the stairs?" The silence that followed was very long and very full. "He's had a proper room for a year," Petunia said. Her voice was slightly strangled. "Good," Molly said. "I'm very glad to hear it." She held Petunia's gaze for just a moment longer, not cruelly, but with the absolute clarity of a woman who knew what she knew and was not going to pretend otherwise. Then she turned to the stairs. "You're welcome to come up. You might prefer to wait here." She climbed the stairs. The second door on the left had a cat flap at the bottom. There were bolts on the outside, 3 of them, she noted, which matched Whitmore's report, and a small lock that had been recently oiled, based on the shine of it. She did not rattle them. She simply noted them. She knocked softly. Silence. She knocked again. "Harry?" "It's Molly Weasley. Ron's mum. I'm not going to hurt you, I just want to talk to you. Can you open the door?" A sound from inside. Movement. And then a voice, younger than she expected, rougher, cautious in the way of someone who had learned that unexpected things in the night were rarely good. "Mrs. Weasley?" "Yes, love," she said. "It's me." A pause. The door opened. He was in pajamas that were 3 sizes too big and clearly not his, Dudley's cast-offs, she noted. She would not say anything about that right now. His hair was going in several directions at once and his glasses were crooked from being put on in a hurry. He was so thin that it landed in her chest like something physical. He was looking at her with an expression that she recognized from her own children at their most uncertain, the look that meant "I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing yet," except that on Harry's face there was an additional layer, something underneath the uncertainty that was much older than 11. He looked past her at the empty hallway. Looking for whoever was with her. Looking for the catch. "Just me," she said quietly. His expression did something complicated that she didn't have a name for. She looked at the room. She looked at it carefully and she stored what she saw and she would write it down later in her formal documentation and it would become part of the record that Amelia Bones would use to do what needed to be done. Right now she simply looked at it, and she let herself feel what she felt about it, and then she set that feeling aside because there was more important work to do. "Harry," she said, and her voice came out very warm and very steady, I have a DMLE warrant. Do you know what that means? He shook his head. It means I have the legal authority to bring you somewhere safe, she said. It means that whatever the Dursleys say, whatever anyone says, you are allowed to leave with me right now. No one can stop me from taking you. She paused. Do you want to come? He stared at her. She watched him understand it. Not just hear the words but actually understand what they meant, that someone had come here, specifically for him, before dawn, with a document from the ministry that said Harry Potter is allowed to leave. She watched him try to find the part where it went wrong, where it was conditional, where she'd say but first you have to or as long as you or we'll see after, all the scaffolding of conditions that children learn to look for when the adults in their lives are unreliable. There wasn't any. Yes, he said. It came out small and then he said it again, steadier. Yes. I want to come. Good, she said. Then let's pack your things. Chapter 2, Number for the room told her everything. Molly had been a mother for 22 years. She had raised 7 children through chicken pox and nightmares and the particular devastation of a broken toy, and she knew the geography of a child's bedroom the way she knew her own kitchen, by feel, by instinct, by what was present and what was conspicuously, deliberately absent. Harry's room had a bed with a mattress that dipped badly on the left side where he'd been sleeping. It had a broken desk that had been repaired badly with the wrong kind of glue. It had a wardrobe with a door that didn't close properly because one of the hinges had been replaced with a different size. And it had, bolted to the outside of the door, she'd counted 3 bolts and a padlock on her way in, a locking mechanism that would have been entirely appropriate for a garden shed and had absolutely no business being on a child's bedroom door. The padlock was open. She noted that, the Dursleys had opened it when she knocked, or it had been opened earlier in the evening and not refastened. Either way, it had been fastened at some point. It had been used. The bolts were new enough that the metal still had a clean sheen, but old enough to show the specific dullness that came from regular use. Regular use. She opened the wardrobe. 3 things hung inside, a school robe, a Hogwarts uniform shirt, and a second shirt that was so oversized it looked like it could fit Vernon Dursley. On the floor of the wardrobe, a battered pair of trainers with a hole beginning over the right toe. Harry was watching her from the doorway of the wardrobe, very still, with the alert careful quality of an animal that had learned to gauge the mood of the room before committing to anything. Your trunk, she said. Is it here? Under the bed, he said. They took the lock off it. She looked at him. Meaning they've been going through it? A small pause. The owl too. Hedwig's at Mrs. Figg's, down the road, they said she was making too much noise. And my wand, Uncle Vernon locked it in his desk in the study. He said, he stopped. What did he say? Harry looked at a point slightly to the left of her shoulder. He said I wasn't going to be doing any more funny business in his house. Molly crouched down and pulled the trunk out from under the bed. The hasp where the padlock had been was bent, not cut, bent, meaning someone had applied a significant amount of force to it. She opened the lid and looked inside. Books, mostly. Some parchment, an ink bottle with the stopper cracked, a quill that needed replacing. A small photo album at the bottom. She caught a glimpse of moving photographs, faces she recognized from wartime, and she closed the lid gently. Right, she said, standing. She turned to face him properly. I need you to listen to me for a moment, because I want to make sure you understand everything that's happening. Can you do that? He nodded. He was doing the thing she'd noticed downstairs, looking for the catch. She was going to have to be very clear. I have a legal warrant from the Ministry of Magic, specifically from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, issued under the authority of Director Amelia Bones. That warrant gives me the authority to remove you from this house tonight if I determine that your welfare is at risk. She watched him carefully. Your wand being locked in your uncle's desk is obstruction of a minor magical citizen's access to their registered magical instrument. The bolts on your door are a welfare concern. The condition of your things and the state of your owl's housing are on record. She paused. Harry, you are leaving with me tonight. That is already decided and it cannot be undecided by anyone in this house or outside of it. What I need from you right now is to help me pack your things and then come downstairs with me while I have a conversation with your aunt and uncle. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to defend yourself or explain anything. You just need to be present. He blinked at her, and she could see him doing the arithmetic, measuring the weight of what she was saying against the possibility that it was untrue, calculating the risk of believing her. They'll say things, he said finally. They always, he stopped again. I know, she said. Dumbledore is not here, Molly said. And doesn't have authority over a DMLE welfare action regardless. You can think about Dumbledore later. Right now, just think about packing. She watched something very specific move across Harry's face then, a small, careful unclenching. Like a muscle that had been held tense for a very long time receiving permission to relax, and not quite knowing how yet. Okay, he said. Good. She waved her wand at the trunk and the clothes from the wardrobe folded themselves and settled neatly inside. Where's the study? The study was on the ground floor, which meant passing through the hallway where Vernon and Petunia were waiting, Vernon at the foot of the stairs with his arms crossed and an expression of aggressive bluster, Petunia slightly behind him with the complicated expression Molly had noted earlier and was still translating. Harry came down the stairs behind Molly, carrying his trunk. He stopped on the second-to-last step when he saw his uncle, and the calculation on his face was immediate and automatic. Where was the exit? What was the likely response? How much space was there to move? That calculation happened so fast and so naturally that it was obvious he'd been doing it for years. Molly stepped between Harry and Vernon, not aggressively, just by placement, and looked at the larger man with the calm of someone who had all the cards and knew it. The study, Mr. Dursley. Harry's wand. Now look here, Mr. Dursley. Her voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. You are currently in obstruction of a DMLE welfare action. The legal penalty for obstruction is a fine of up to 5,000 galleons and a possible 6-month custodial sentence. I mention this not as a threat, but as information I am legally required to provide you when conducting this action. She tilted her head slightly. The study. Vernon's face had gone through several colors during this speech. It settled on a deep puce that she found, privately, quite alarming from a cardiovascular standpoint. You people, he said. Coming into a man's home in the middle of the, yes, Molly agreed. We are. The study, Mr. Dursley. He looked at her. He looked at the warrant she was still holding. He looked at her wand, which was in her hand in the easy, relaxed grip of someone who was very good with it and had absolutely nothing to prove. He turned and walked down the hall. She followed him, and Harry followed her, and the study was exactly as she'd expected, the desk of a man who considered himself important, large and dark and covered in papers relating to the sales of drills, and in the top right drawer, locked, Harry's wand. Key, she said. Vernon unlocked the drawer. She took the wand and handed it back to Harry without ceremony, like it was simply the obvious thing to do, which it was. Harry took it and his hand closed around it and something in the line of his shoulders shifted in a way she recognized, a person who had just recovered something they hadn't realized they were missing so badly. He put it in his pajama pocket, which made her briefly want to get him some proper clothes immediately, but they were addressing one thing at a time. Thank you, she said to Vernon, pleasantly. Now. Shall we sit down? They sat in the living room, which was the largest and most expensively furnished room in the house and which managed despite all of that to feel completely hollow, the way rooms felt when they were decorated to impress rather than to be lived in. There was a fireplace with a mantel covered in Dudley photographs, a large sofa arrangement in cream fabric, a television so big it occupied most of one wall. Harry sat next to Molly on the sofa. Vernon lowered himself into the armchair opposite like a man taking a defensive position, and Petunia sat on the arm of his chair in a way that told you she was too anxious to commit to sitting properly. Molly set the warrant on the coffee table between them. She set a second document next to it, a copy of Whitmore's welfare flag, which she brought for exactly this purpose. "I'm going to explain what's going to happen," she said. "And then I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like honest answers, because the alternative is that everything gets documented as uncooperative and goes on the record for the Wisengamot inquiry." "Wisengamot," Vernon started. "A formal inquiry has been opened into the welfare arrangement at this address," Molly said. "That was filed this morning simultaneously with the warrant. It is already on record and it will proceed regardless of what happens in this room tonight." She kept her voice level. "The inquiry is not something I am threatening you with. It is something that has already happened." The room was very quiet. Petunia was looking at the warrant. Her eyes moved across the text with the focused attention of a woman reading something very carefully. "Harry is leaving with me tonight," Molly continued. "He will be living with my family for the foreseeable future. A formal application for temporary guardianship will be filed with the ministry this week and will almost certainly be approved given the circumstances. You will be contacted by the Wisengamot Inquiry Committee, probably within the fortnight, and you will be asked to cooperate with their investigation." She paused. "I want to be very clear that how you respond to all of this is entirely your choice. But it will go considerably better for you if you cooperate honestly." Vernon had, during this speech, progressed through Puce back to a sort of furious pale. "Better for us? Better for us? We took the boy in when nobody else wanted him, we housed him, fed him, gave him a home, Uncle Vernon," Harry said, quietly. Something about the way he said it, not heated, not frightened, just very flat and tired, made Vernon stop. Harry was looking at his uncle with an expression that was very old for his face. "You put me in a cupboard for 10 years, he said. "You told me my parents died in a car crash. You locked my wand in your desk and my owl at Mrs. Figg's and my letters." He stopped and looked at Molly. "My letters were stopped." "Yes," she said. "The letter I sent you 3 weeks ago was returned unopened." Harry nodded slowly, like he was fitting a piece into something he'd already been assembling. "We were protecting you," Petunia said. Her voice was different from her husband's, lower, more controlled, but there was something corded through it. "Everything we did was to keep you normal. Safe. Away from all of," she gestured vaguely, indicating in the gesture the warrant, Molly's robes, the wand, the whole of the world she was clearly trying not to name. Harry looked at his aunt. He didn't say anything. The silence was doing more work than words would have. Molly let it sit for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Mrs. Dursley. Can I ask you about the cupboard?" Petunia's jaw tightened. "He lived there for how long?" Molly asked. "Until his Hogwarts letter," Petunia said. "When the letters came, dozens of them, there were dozens, Vernon moved him upstairs. To get him away from," she stopped. "From the evidence," Harry said, still in that flat, tired voice. "Harry," Molly said, not a warning, just a quiet acknowledgement. "No, he's right," Petunia said, and the cord in her voice pulled tighter and then, unexpectedly, something else moved through her expression, something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief but occupied the same neighborhood as both. "He's right. We moved him because the letters said his name and his room and we didn't want," she stopped. She looked at her husband and then at the table and then at a point somewhere to the left of Harry's face that was clearly easier to look at. "We weren't unkind," she said, and even as she said it, she seemed to hear how it sounded. "You locked my door," Harry said. "Every night." Petunia said nothing. "Why?" Harry asked. It wasn't angry. It was the question of someone who had been wanting to ask it for a very long time and had never quite had the circumstances that made asking safe. I didn't do anything. I was just there." "Why did you lock the door?" The silence stretched. "Because you frightened us," Petunia said at last. Her voice had gone very thin. "Not you, what was inside you? What happened around you when you were small? Things moved. Things broke. Vernon's, There was an incident with Vernon's car once, when you were 3, Toonie, Vernon said, warning. It doesn't matter now, Petunia said sharply. She looked at her husband for a moment and then back at Harry, and her expression was the most honest thing Molly had seen on her face all evening. We didn't know how to manage it. We didn't know what you were yet, and we were afraid of it, Anne. She stopped. I know that isn't a justification. I'm not offering it as a justification. Then what are you offering it as? Harry asked. No answer. Molly gave the silence a moment and then she picked up the warrant and Whitmore's report and she stood. I've documented this conversation, she said, tapping her temple where the memory was stored for later pensive review. It will be included in the inquiry record. She looked at both Dursleys. I want you to understand that what happens next, with the inquiry, with the guardianship, is about Harry's welfare, not about punishing you. The inquiry will determine what penalties, if any, are appropriate. That's not my job tonight. She paused. My job tonight is to take Harry somewhere safe. Vernon opened his mouth. Mr. Dursley, she said, pleasantly, finally, and with complete finality. Good night. They got Hedwig from Mrs. Figg's, which required a detour down a dark street and a brief knock on the door of a house smelling powerfully of cabbage and cat, and Mrs. Figg answered in a housecoat and took one look at Molly Weasley and the DMLE Warrant and said, oh thank goodness, with the relief of someone who had been waiting for this particular night for a very long time. She brought Hedwig's cage out herself. The owl inside looked at Harry with an expression of profound personal affront at the indignity of her recent housing arrangements, then looked at Molly with something that might have been gratitude, which Hedwig would have denied if pressed. You'll tell Albus? Mrs. Figg asked, still looking at Molly. He'll find out, Molly said. He should have. Mrs. Figg stopped and shook her head. Never mind. It's done now. She looked at Harry with a warmth that surprised him. Based on his expression, they'd clearly had a somewhat neutral relationship as far as he'd known. You'll be all right, dear, she said. You'll be more than all right. Harry said, thank you, the way he said it, with that careful formality, and carried Hedwig's cage back up the street. Molly walked beside him. The night was warm enough that the walk was pleasant, or would have been under different circumstances. The street was very quiet, the houses all dark, the sky beginning to show the very first watercolor lightning at the horizon that meant dawn was maybe 90 minutes away. Harry said nothing for most of the walk. She didn't push him. She'd learned with her own children that the right time to talk was rarely the moment you wanted to prompt it. You waited, and you stayed present, and eventually the thing that needed saying found its way out. They were almost back at number 4 when he said, is it really legal? Me leaving? They're my guardians. They are, she said. Or they were. The warrant supersedes the guardianship arrangement in a welfare situation. And the application I'm filing this week will transfer temporary guardianship to me, which will formalize everything. And Dumbledore can't, he can't make them take me back. She considered her answer carefully. Not because the answer was complicated, but because she wanted to give him the version that was true rather than the version that was reassuring, because she suspected he'd had too much of the reassuring version. Dumbledore can argue that the blood wards require you to live with your relatives, she said. He has a genuine magical basis for that argument and I'm not going to pretend he doesn't. He'll raise it with the Wisengamot, and the Wisengamot will look at what Whitmore's report says and at what the inquiry finds and they'll weigh the magical protection argument against the welfare situation. She looked at him. I think the welfare situation will win. I think it should win. And I think Dumbledore, when he's had to say his argument out loud in front of people who are writing it down, is going to find it harder to maintain than he expects. Harry was quiet, processing. But tonight, she said, tonight you're coming to the Burrow, and that is happening, and nothing and nobody is undoing it. What happens after that, we'll deal with after that. Okay, he said. Then, after another moment, why did you come yourself? Not, like, why not just send an aura or something? She looked at him. He was watching her with genuine curiosity, the kind of question a clever child asks when they've been puzzling at something for a while. "Because you know me," she said simply. "And because you deserve to have someone come who actually," she paused, "who actually wanted to come. Not someone doing their job." He didn't say anything to that. He looked away, quickly, and she could see him doing the same thing he'd done upstairs when she'd said he was allowed to leave, that small, careful unclenching, the muscle that hadn't known it could relax. "Okay," he said again, and this time it meant something different. They went back inside number 4 one final time. The Dursleys had retreated, Vernon to the kitchen, where she could hear him making tea with the aggressive energy of a man who needed something to do with his hands, and Petunia to the living room, which was where Molly went to do the last piece of the formal process. "Mrs. Dursley," she said. "I need you to sign a temporary release of guardianship. It's a standard welfare document. It doesn't carry any additional legal weight beyond what the warrant already establishes, but it makes the transition cleaner for Harry's school records and the ministry's paperwork." Petunia looked at the document Molly held out to her. She looked at the quill. She signed. It was one of those moments that was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. All of it, the cupboard, the locked door, the returned letters, and at the end, a signature. A mundane transfer of paper authority. But Molly had learned that most of the significant moments in life arrived without ceremony, and the ones that did have ceremony were usually trying to compensate for something. "He'll be safe?" Petunia asked, and her voice was the voice of a woman asking something she had wanted to ask for a very long time and had been refusing to allow herself to articulate. Molly looked at her steadily. "Yes." Petunia nodded, very slightly, like she was accepting a small payment toward a larger debt. "Lily would have," she started. "Yes," Molly said, and left it there, and Petunia looked away. Molly went back into the hallway. Harry was at the bottom of the stairs with his trunk, Hedwig's cage, and a small rucksack she hadn't seen before, the photo album tucked under his arm, she noticed. He'd packed the album separately, carried it himself, not trusted it to the trunk. She looked at him. 11 years old, standing in the hallway of the house that had kept him without ever quite keeping him, holding his photographs of his parents, wearing pajamas that didn't fit. "Ready?" she said. He looked up the stairs once, not at anything specific, not with any particular emotion she could name, just a last look at the place, the automatic gesture of someone leaving. "Yeah," he said. She shrunk the trunk and the cage and put them in her pocket, which made Harry blink. She took the rucksack and slung it over her shoulder. "You'll need to hold on," she said. Side-along apparition. He reached up and gripped her arm, and she noted, carefully, and stored it for later, how tentative the grip was. Like he was still asking permission. She covered his hand with hers and squeezed once, briefly, and felt him hold on properly. Then she turned, and the hallway of number 4 vanished. The burrow arrived around them in the way the burrow always did, chaotically, warmly, without apology. It was the kind of house that couldn't be described properly without sounding like you were making it up, because it shouldn't have been structurally possible, and yet there it was, crooked and warm and lit in the windows even at this hour because Arthur had clearly not slept. Harry let go of her arm and stood in the garden path and looked at it. She watched him look at it. The tilted chimney stacks, the different window sizes, the washing line that still had a pair of Ron's Quidditch robes pinned to it in the windless dark. The orange glow of the kitchen window. "It looks the same," he said, quietly. "It always does," she said. "Come on, it's cold." It wasn't particularly cold, it was a warm summer night, but she said it anyway because it was the thing you said, the thing that meant come inside, there is warmth here, it belongs to you right now. She got the door. Arthur was at the kitchen table with 4 different stacks of parchment and a pot of tea that had been reheated so many times it was starting to taste geological, and he looked up when she opened the door and his face did the thing it did when he was very relieved about something and was trying not to show it too obviously. "Harry," he said. "Hi, Mr. Weasley," Harry said, from the doorway. Come in, come in." Arthur stood up and moved papers and pulled out a chair with the welcoming energy of a man who would have done all of this more elaborately if it hadn't been 4 in the morning. Sit down. Are you hungry? Harry's answer to that question was the same one it always was, a reflexive, no, thank you, delivered in the tone of someone who'd been told their appetite was an inconvenience. Molly put a plate of sandwiches in front of him anyway. Thick ones, proper ones, chicken and a little mustard. Harry looked at the sandwiches and then at her, and she busied herself with the tea so he could eat without feeling observed, which was the trick she'd learned years ago with the twins when they were going through the growth spurt phase where they ate constantly and were embarrassed about it. She heard him pick up the first sandwich. She heard him eat 3 of them. She kept her back to him and concentrated very hard on the tea. The papers are looking good, Arthur said, tapping the parchment stacks. He was using his easiest, most conversational voice, the voice he used when he was trying to discuss something serious in a way that didn't make it feel heavy. The standing order provision is exactly what we thought. The temporary guardianship application is straightforward. He glanced at Harry. We'll have it sorted in a week, I'd say. Yeah. Harry said, around a sandwich. Straightforward case, Arthur said, nodding. Clean documentation, clear welfare grounds, no complicating factors. He picked up one of the papers and squinted at it in a way that was probably partly theatrical. Might need your signature on a few things, just for the record. Nothing dramatic. Harry nodded. He was starting to look tired, the initial tension that had kept him upright and alert beginning to loosen now that he was somewhere familiar and fed and warm. His eyes kept tracking to the kitchen door, to the stairs, to the windows, not anxiously, exactly, just the automatic environmental monitoring of someone who hadn't yet learned to switch it off. Ron's asleep, Molly said, sitting down across from him. He doesn't know you're here yet. I thought you could tell him yourself in the morning. Harry's mouth turned up at the corner. The first thing approaching a smile she'd seen from him tonight. He'll lose his mind, he said. Completely, Arthur agreed, with feeling. The twins are also asleep, Molly said. Please prepare yourself. How bad? Harry asked. They're very happy you'll be here, Molly said, in the careful tone of a person who was technically saying something true while declining to elaborate. Harry looked at Arthur, who looked at Molly, who looked at the ceiling. Right, Harry said. Ginny knows you're coming, Molly said. She's been very, she searched for the word, composed about it. Arthur made a very small sound that he converted into a cough. Molly chose not to hear this. Harry looked like he might say something about Ginny and then thought better of it, which she found privately reassuring because it suggested a basic level of social awareness that the Dursley household probably hadn't done anything to cultivate. She took the unshrunk trunk and cage from her pocket and set them properly on the kitchen floor, and Harry looked at his things, actually present, not locked away or confiscated or at Mrs. Figg's, and something moved across his face again. I'll show you up to Ron's room, Arthur said, standing. It's fine, Arthur, I'll do it, he said, and his voice was very gentle about it, which meant he wanted a moment alone with Harry, which Molly allowed without comment because Arthur very rarely asked for things and she trusted his instincts with people. Harry followed Arthur to the stairs. In the doorway, he stopped and turned back. Mrs. Weasley, he said. She looked at him. He was backlit from the hallway, rumpled and tired and wearing Dudley's hand-me-down pajamas, his glasses slightly crooked again from however he'd been sitting, the photo album tucked under his arm where it had been since Privet Drive. Thank you, he said. And unlike the formal careful thank you he'd given Mrs. Figg, this one was different. This one had something raw and slightly uncertain underneath it, like he was still not completely sure the thing he was thanking her for was real and permanent, and if he looked too hard at it it might dissolve. Molly kept her voice very steady. You're welcome, love. Get some sleep. He nodded and turned and went upstairs, and she heard Arthur's low voice and Harry's quieter one and then the sound of a door and then quiet. She sat down at the kitchen table in the burrow, which was slightly sticky with someone's jam from breakfast yesterday and had a crack along one side that Arthur had repaired 3 times and it kept coming back, and she put both hands flat on it and she breathed. She was very tired. It was 4 in the morning and she'd been running on the particular high-grade fuel of righteous purpose since about 8 o'clock yesterday, and now it was metabolizing and she could feel the underside of it. She thought about what Petunia had said. "Because you frightened us." She thought about Vernon's face when she'd mentioned the Wisengamot. She thought about 3 bolts on a child's bedroom door. She thought about 40 square feet and a toy soldier and drawings on the wall. She picked up the returned letter from the inside pocket of her robes. She'd brought it with her, it was evidence, and she looked at the stamp on it. "Recipient may not receive correspondence." She set it down on top of Arthur's parchment stacks. Then she picked up the warrant, which still smelled slightly of the DMLE's official wax, and she set that down next to it, and she looked at both documents together. She'd done it. He was here. He was asleep upstairs in Ron's room, or would be in a few minutes, and in the morning he would wake up in the burrow and Ron would lose his mind and the twins would do something inadvisable and Ginny would be composed about it, and Molly would make a breakfast large enough to embarrass a professional chef and she would watch Harry Potter eat it and she would not make it obvious that she was watching, and it would be the first morning of something entirely different. She heard Arthur's footsteps on the stairs, coming back down. She heard, from somewhere in the house above her, the very particular sound of a boy who'd stopped waiting for the catch, just for a moment, the absence of it, the held breath of someone who had let themselves stop waiting, and then the quieter sound of someone who was very tired finally allowing themselves to sleep. She folded her hands on the kitchen table. "Well," Arthur said, from the doorway. "Well," she agreed. He came and sat next to her and they looked at the warrant and the returned letter and all his careful parchment stacks in the 4 o'clock kitchen, and outside the window the horizon was doing the first faint, almost imperceptible thing that was not quite light but was the very beginning of its intention. Before dawn, she'd told herself. She'd left with Harry before dawn. It turned out before dawn was exactly the right time. Chapter 3, The Burrow. Before breakfast Harry woke up and didn't know where he was. That happened sometimes at Hogwarts too, in the first week back, that split second of total disorientation before the dormitory resolved itself around him, the red hangings, Ron's snoring, the smell of old wood and something faintly magical. But this was different because the ceiling was the wrong shape. It was lower on one side and higher on the other, like the room had been built by someone who considered symmetry optional, and there was an orange poster directly above him of a Quidditch player in mid-dive, and the light coming through the window was early morning gold, and he was in Ron's room at the Burrow. He lay still for a moment, taking stock of this fact. He was in Ron's room at the Burrow. He had arrived at 4 in the morning in Molly Weasley's wake, and he had eaten 3 chicken sandwiches at the kitchen table, and Arthur Weasley had walked him upstairs and said sleep as long as you like, nobody'll bother you in the voice of someone who genuinely meant it, and Harry had put on the spare set of pajamas that were on the camp bed, actual pajamas that fit, the first time that had happened, and he had meant to lie there thinking through everything that had happened and instead he had fallen directly and completely asleep before he'd finished the thought. Ron was still asleep in the bed across the room, one arm hanging off the side, mouth open, making the specific breathing sound that had taken Harry most of a school year to stop hearing as alarming. Harry sat up carefully and found his glasses on the bedside table, exactly where he'd put them. He sat there in the morning light, glasses on, looking at Ron sleeping, looking at the room, the posters and the Quidditch figurines and the model broom hanging from the ceiling on a piece of wire and the pile of books in the corner that were almost certainly not homework related, and he thought about the fact that he was here, legally, with documentation, and that nobody was coming to take him back. He thought about the bolts on his door. Not in the way he usually thought about things from Privet Drive, which was the same way he thought about most unpleasant things, quickly, sideways, and then firmly away. He thought about them directly, which was new. He thought about the sound they made when they were thrown from outside. He thought about the particular quality of the dark in that room, which was different from the dark in the cupboard, which had been smaller and closer and had a hot water pipe that made a sound at 2 in the morning that he'd spent years telling himself was just the house settling. He thought, that's over. Not convincingly, not yet, but he thought it. Ron made a sound, turned over, fell off the edge of the mattress, and woke up on the floor with a yell that knocked several Chudley Cannon's figurines off the shelf above him. Harry said, "Morning." Ron scrambled upright, hair going in 6 directions, duvet half on the floor, staring at Harry with an expression of complete bafflement. "Harry?" "Yeah." "What are you? How are you? When did you?" Ron sat on the floor amid his fallen figurines and stared. "Are you actually here? In my room? Right now?" "Apparently." "How?" "Your uncle, your mum," Harry said. "She came and got me. Last night." He paused. "This morning, technically. It was about 3. Ron stared at him for another long moment. Then he looked at the door, then back at Harry, and something complicated moved through his expression. Guilt, Harry recognized, the specific guilt of someone who had seen a thing and not known what to do about it and had been sitting with that for a while. "I told her about the cat flap," Ron said. "I know. I should have told her sooner, I think." "I didn't, I wasn't sure if it was, Ron," Harry said. "It's fine." "It's not, though," Ron said, very directly, which was not how Ron usually talked about things and which meant he'd been sitting with this for a while. "I went there and I saw your room and the thing on the door and I thought, I don't know. I thought there must be a reason. Because of Dumbledore. Because of the wards." "Yeah," Harry said. "Everyone thought that." Ron looked at him. "Are you angry about it?" Harry considered this genuinely, which was new. Normally the question would have been answered reflexively, "No, it's fine, don't worry about it," the conversational self-erasure he'd been doing his whole life. But this morning, in the light, in the camp bed, he tried the question on honestly. "A bit," he said. "Not at you." Ron nodded. He seemed to find this reasonable. "At Dumbledore?" "Yeah," Harry said. "A bit at Dumbledore." "Mum's furious at Dumbledore," Ron said, with a certain grim satisfaction. "I noticed. When Mum gets that quiet, I noticed that too." Ron nodded again, considering. Then he seemed to shake himself out of whatever he'd been sitting in and his face rearranged into something more recognizably Ron-shaped, wide awake, already thinking about breakfast, moving on with the enthusiastic practicality of someone who processed difficult things by returning immediately to the present. "Right. You hungry?" "Because Mum's going to cook enough for about 15 people when she sees you're up." "Already looking forward to it," Harry said honestly. Ron grinned and the room was just a room again, messy and warm and orange, and Harry found it considerably easier to breathe in than the room he'd woken up in yesterday. The kitchen smelled like bacon and fresh bread and something sweet that Harry couldn't identify yet. He came down the stairs behind Ron and stopped in the doorway because the kitchen at the Burrow was already operating at full capacity even though it was barely 7 in the morning. Molly was at the stove. She had 3 pans going and the wireless on low and a cup of tea balanced on the corner of the counter in a way that defied both physics and common sense, and she was conducting the whole operation with her wand in one hand and a spatula in the other in what appeared to be a fully improvised orchestral arrangement. Arthur was at the table with a new stack of papers, looking more rested than he had any right to after 4 hours of sleep. Percy was also at the table, in his prefect badge and reading a book about ministry regulations, which said everything you needed to know about Percy before breakfast. Fred and George were not at the table. Fred and George were standing in the kitchen doorway on the other side from Harry, watching the stove with the focused professional attention of 2 people assessing a situation for exploitable variables. Molly said, without turning around, "Don't even think about it." Fred said, "We weren't thinking about anything." "You were thinking about the marmalade." "That's very presumptuous, Mum." "George, put the marmalade down." George, who had been in the process of subtly relocating the marmalade, put it down. Then both of them saw Harry in the doorway and everything stopped. Fred and George Weasley looking at you with complete simultaneous focus was a specific experience. They didn't do it often, usually at least one of them was performing something while the other provided commentary, but when they both went still and looked at the same thing at the same time, it had a quality to it. Harry Potter, Fred said. In our kitchen, George said. Before breakfast, Fred said. Mum, George said, not looking away from Harry, did you actually? Yes, Molly said, from the stove. I did. Brilliant, Fred said, quietly, and it was so genuinely said, without performance, without the usual comedic overlay, that Harry found himself completely unprepared for it. Come sit down, George said, moving away from the doorway with the ease of someone who had given up a position voluntarily. You look like you need about 4 breakfasts. He does, Molly confirmed. Sit down, Harry. Harry sat down. Percy looked up from his regulations book, looked at Harry, looked at his mother, and said, Is this officially sanctioned? There's a DMLE warrant, Molly said. 4 pages. Amelia Bones's personal seal. Would you like to read it after breakfast? Percy looked like he would very much like to read it after breakfast. Yes please, he said, and went back to his regulations. Arthur looked at Harry over the rim of his reading glasses with an expression that was mostly amusement and partly something warmer. Sleep all right? Yeah, Harry said. Really well, actually. Good bed, that camp bed, Arthur said, nodding. We've had it since, when, Molly? Charlie's second year, Molly said, without looking up from the pan that was currently producing a quantity of bacon that seemed ambitious even by Weasley standards. Still going strong, Arthur said. Ron sat down next to Harry and immediately stole a piece of toast from the rack in the middle of the table, which Molly hadn't told anyone to stop touching yet but which was still technically not ready based on the way she'd looked at the toast rack. She didn't say anything about it, which Harry understood was because Ron stealing toast at the table was the sort of ordinary thing that ordinary families let slide and he was being allowed to exist inside that ordinariness without special conditions. He took a piece of toast. Nobody said anything. He ate it. This small sequence of events, taking the toast, eating it, nobody commenting, was so unremarkable and so quietly necessary that he stored it somewhere he couldn't quite name. Ginny came down the stairs at 7:30 with her hair pulled back and an expression of determined composure that collapsed almost immediately when she reached the bottom step and found Harry at the kitchen table. She stopped. She looked at him. She looked at her mother. She looked back at Harry. You're here, she said. Hi Ginny, Harry said. She went pink, which was the expected development. Then, to her clear credit, she walked directly to the table, sat down, and helped herself to eggs with the energy of someone making a deliberate decision to be normal about this. Good, she said, to no one in particular. Composed, Fred murmured to George. Very composed, George agreed. Both of you stop, Ginny said, without heat. Breakfast was large and loud and Harry ate more than he had in weeks without anyone making a remark about it. He ate bacon and eggs and toast and a thing that turned out to be a Weasley variation on a crumpet, and he drank 2 glasses of pumpkin juice and ate a bowl of something that Molly called porridge but which had so much brown sugar and cinnamon in it that it barely qualified as a health food anymore, and the kitchen was so full of conversation that no single thread of it demanded his full attention, which meant he could just exist inside it. Float inside the noise and warmth and the ongoing Fred and George commentary on everything, and the wireless playing something cheerful from under a stack of Arthur's parchment, and Percy marking pages in his regulations book with small colored flags. He thought, without meaning to, I could get used to this. He thought, immediately after, careful. And then, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he thought, no. Actually. Don't be careful. Just have breakfast. Molly set a final plate in front of him, 2 more pieces of bacon, because he'd slowed down and she'd clearly interpreted that as completion rather than satiety, and she sat down across from him with her own tea and looked at him in the warm, direct way she had. We'll need to get you some proper clothes today, she said. And school supplies for the year, we were planning on Diagon Alley next week regardless. She said it practically, not making it into a thing, which he appreciated. "I've got some money," he said. "In Gringotts." "We know," she said. "We'll sort it." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Is there anything you need that you didn't get from Privet Drive? Anything that was left behind?" He thought about it. He thought about the broken desk and the dipping mattress and the Dudley-sized clothes and came up, genuinely, with nothing that he wanted back from there. "No," he said. "I had everything important." She nodded, and he knew she understood what he meant, the photo album, the trunk, Hedwig, the wand, and that she understood also what he wasn't saying, which was that everything important was not a very long list for an 11-year-old and that this was its own kind of evidence. "Right then," she said. The wireless crackled and then settled back into something instrumental and the twins started a low-grade argument about whose turn it was to degnome the garden and Ron joined in defensively and Percy told all three of them that the garden rotation schedule he'd made in June was still on the fridge and this descended into a collective interrogation of the fridge, which did in fact contain a schedule in Percy's precise handwriting. Harry watched this happen from his end of the table and he felt something he recognized, the specific warmth of being in a room where things were happening around him and he didn't have to manage any of them. Where he was allowed to just watch and be in it. He finished his second extra bacon. After breakfast, Molly disappeared into a fluke conversation that she conducted with the kitchen fire with her head actually in the fireplace, which Harry still found extraordinary as a method of communication, and Arthur went back to his parchment in the garden with a levitated mug of tea, and Percy vanished upstairs to read the warrant, which Molly had left on the kitchen table with the focused restraint of someone who had made a deliberate pedagogical decision. Ron took Harry outside, and the twins materialized within about 4 minutes with the brooms, and within 15 minutes they were playing an improvised Quidditch variant in the field behind the garden that had rules entirely invented by Fred and George and which appeared to change whenever one of them started losing. Harry flew. He flew in a way he hadn't since the last Quidditch match of the year, which had been against Hufflepuff and had been won cleanly, and there was a particular quality to flying when you weren't performing or competing, when it was just the air and the height and the sharp turn and your body knowing what to do before your mind had finished the instruction. George threw something at him from across the field, a fist-sized ball they transfigured from an apple, and Harry caught it one-handed without thinking, already banking left, and when he came around Ron was on the ground looking up at him with an expression that was half affectionate and half exasperated. "Show off," Ron said. "You threw it," Harry said, though it had been George. "I meant him," Ron said, jerking his thumb at George. "I was demonstrating our seeker's abilities," George said, landing next to Ron with the unhurried dignity of someone who had absolutely been showing off. "For reference purposes." "Reference for what?" Ron said. "For the record," Fred said, landing on the other side. "Which we are keeping. Of things Harry can do." Harry looked at him from 10 feet up. "What things?" "Well," Fred said, in the tone he used when he was about to say something either very clever or very chaotic, and sometimes both, "you caught a transfigured apple from 40 feet in a crosswind on a broom that's about 3 years past its service date. That's one thing. Also," George said, "when you came down the stairs this morning, Mum's teacup that's been wobbling on the counter since Tuesday suddenly stopped wobbling." Harry blinked. "What?" "She didn't say anything about it," Fred said. "She just kept cooking. But it stopped." Harry thought about this. He hadn't noticed doing anything. He'd just come into the kitchen and the cup had been teetering and he'd noticed it and then, he hadn't done anything, he was sure he hadn't done anything. "Accidental magic," he said. "Maybe," George said, in the tone that meant probably not. Ron was looking at Harry with the expression he got when he was thinking about chess, measuring something, working out a position. "Does it happen a lot? The accidental stuff?" Harry shrugged. He thought about the incident with Aunt Marge's sister's dog, second year of primary school. He thought about the time he'd ended up on the school roof. He thought about the glass at the snake enclosure. He thought about how, every time something like that happened, it was usually because he was either very frightened or very frustrated or, usually when I need something, he said. Or when I'm really angry. "Useful," Fred said. Or when something needs protecting, Harry added, and wasn't sure why he said it. He hadn't thought about it in those terms before. The twins looked at each other. Whatever passed between them in that look was complex and quick. Right, Fred said. So you're basically, don't, George said, mildly, and Fred stopped. Harry looked between them. Basically what? Basically very interesting to fly with, George said smoothly, which was not what Fred had been about to say, and all four of them knew it. Come on, there's a better crosswind past the gnome patch. Harry didn't push it. He found, recently, that he had less appetite for getting to the bottom of things than he probably should, less appetite for the why and the how and the what exactly do you mean, because every time he tried to get to the bottom of something in his life the bottom had turned out to be further down and darker than he'd expected. He'd get there eventually. Right now there was a crosswind past the gnome patch. He pushed the broom into a climb and let the morning air run cold over his face and thought about nothing at all. Ginny found him in the garden at noon. He'd come down from the field when Ron and the twins were called in by Molly for something that sounded like it involved the twins and the contents of the garden shed, which was its own separate ongoing situation. He'd walked back through the garden and sat on the old stone wall that ran along the back of it, in the sun, with Hedwig, who had apparently forgiven the indignity of Mrs. Figg's house and arrived at the burrow via the window of Ron's room at some point during breakfast, on his shoulder, talking to him in the low manner of a bird with opinions. Ginny came through the garden gate with 2 cups of something hot and sat down on the wall about 2 feet away from him, which was close enough to be friendly and far enough to be fine. Here, she said, holding out a cup. Thanks. He took it. Hot chocolate. He looked at it for a moment. Mum makes it with real chocolate, Ginny said. Not powder. She shaves it off a block. Harry took a sip. It was extraordinary. It was also, based on the expression on Ginny's face, which was watching him take the sip with carefully controlled anticipation, clearly something she was proud to know about, like she was sharing something good, and he thought about how she'd said you're here this morning when she'd come downstairs, and the 2-word weight of it. It's really good, he said. She looked satisfied. Hedwig made a sound and tilted her head at Ginny with an expression of critical evaluation. She always look at people like that? Ginny asked. Yeah, Harry said. I think she's deciding if she likes you. Ginny looked at the owl steadily, which was either brave or sensible, and Hedwig appeared to make a decision and looked away, which Harry had come to understand was the owl's version of approval. She's brilliant, Ginny said. Ron told me about her. Harry stroked Hedwig's feathers, and she tolerated this with the regal patience of someone receiving a tribute that was their due. The garden was quiet except for whatever was happening in the shed, which involved at least one loud bang and some shouting that was definitely Fred. Did you know? Harry asked. He wasn't sure how to phrase it more specifically, but Ginny seemed to follow him. Mum mentioned she was worried about you at the end of term, she said. I could tell she was more than worried. And then when I asked her last night, the way she was sitting at the table, she wrapped both hands around her mug, she looked like someone who'd made a decision. Mum looks different when she's decided something. You can't really argue with it. Yeah, Harry said. I noticed. Was it? She stopped. She was looking at her hot chocolate rather than at him, which he appreciated because it meant he didn't have to arrange his face into anything. Was it bad? There. He thought about the honest answer versus the easy answer and tried to find the place where they overlapped. Yes, he said. She nodded, very slightly, like she'd known and had been giving him the option not to confirm it. It's done now, Harry said. And meant it more than he'd meant most things recently. Yeah, Ginny said. She looked up at the house, the tilted chimney, the impossible upper floors, the washing still on the line. Mum's not going to let anything happen to you. She gets a look when she's decided about someone. She paused. She got the same look about Percy when he fell off his broom at 9. And about Fred when he tried to make a port key out of the kitchen tap. She just decides you're hers and then that's it. Harry sat with this for a moment. The garden smelled like grass and Fred's recent explosion and the faint warm vanilla of the hot chocolate. "She doesn't even know me that well," he said. Ginny looked at him with an expression that was 11 years old and entirely too direct. "She knows you well enough," she said. He didn't have an answer for that, so he drank his hot chocolate, and the garden was quiet and warm, and Hedwig made a contemplative sound and closed her eyes in the sun. The afternoon brought three things: Molly returning from her flu call with news, Percy emerging from upstairs with the warrant and several questions, and Dobby. The last one was unexpected. Harry was in the kitchen helping Ron, not cooking, just existing near Ron while Ron nominally attempted to make biscuits and actually made a significant mess, when there was a sound like a small thunderclap near the fridge and Dobby appeared on the kitchen floor. Ron shouted. The biscuit dough went sideways. Hedwig, who had been on the windowsill, made an extremely undignified sound. Dobby looked up at Harry with enormous eyes and then around the kitchen with an expression of someone who had arrived somewhere and was immediately reassessing whether they'd thought this through. "Harry Potter, sir," Dobby said. "Dobby has been very worried for Harry Potter, Dobby," Harry said, crouching down to be level, which was a thing he'd noticed he did automatically with Dobby. "It's okay. I'm fine. I got out." "Dobby knows," Dobby said. Dobby felt the wards change this morning. The protections, they shifted. Harry Potter is no longer at the Dursley place. "That's right," Harry said. "I'm at the Burrow. With the Weasleys." Dobby looked at Ron, who was still holding the biscuit dough in one hand with the frozen expression of someone experiencing something for the first time. Then Dobby looked around the kitchen with an expression that shifted from anxious to something warmer. "This is a good place," Dobby said. He seemed certain of it, the way house elves were sometimes certain of things in ways that made you feel like they were sensing something you couldn't. "Yeah," Harry said. "It is." Dobby wanted to tell Harry Potter. Dobby's ears drooped slightly, in the way they did when he was managing complicated feelings. "Dobby is sorry. For the pudding. For the warning that was not a proper warning because Dobby did not want Harry Potter to go back but went about it in the wrong way." Harry looked at him. The memory of the pudding incident, the soaring dessert, the Masons, Vernon's face, arrived with some residual irritation that dissolved, mostly, when he looked at Dobby's expression. "It's all right," he said. "It is not all right," Dobby said firmly, which was such an uncharacteristically assertive thing for Dobby to say that Harry blinked. It caused Harry Potter to be punished, and it was wrong. Dobby was trying to protect and made things worse. Dobby is saying sorry properly. Harry looked at the elf for a moment. "Okay," he said. "I accept." Dobby appeared to experience a significant internal event. He straightened, and his ears came up, and there was a quality to his expression that Harry hadn't seen before, something with dignity in it. Molly appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Dobby, looked at Harry, looked at Ron and the biscuit situation, and made a set of rapid assessments. "Hello," she said, to Dobby, very pleasantly. Dobby looked up at her. He looked at her for a long time with the quality of someone reading something very thoroughly. Then, to Harry's complete astonishment, Dobby sat down on the kitchen floor, crossed his legs, and said, "You are the one who came." "Yes," Molly said, simply. Dobby nodded, very slowly, like he was processing a confirmation of something he'd already known. "The wards felt it," he said. "When they shifted this morning. They felt relief. The magic in the protection, there was relief in it." He looked at Harry. Lily Potter's magic. It wanted Harry Potter to be safe. When someone finally made him safe, the wards, he stopped, and his eyes were very large and very bright. "They felt glad," he said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Harry looked at the floor. He looked at the small cracks in the flagstone and the flour Ron had spilled and the small paw print that was probably from one of the garden gnomes, and he thought about Lily Potter's magic being glad, and found, quite unexpectedly, that his throat had gone tight. "Right," he said, after a moment. "Right," Ron agreed, very quietly, in the way Ron agreed with things when he didn't have words. Molly said, briskly and warmly, "Will you stay for tea, Dobby? We're having a proper one, if you'd like." Dobby looked at her with an expression of someone being offered something they had never been offered before and had no framework for receiving. "Dobby would like that very much," he said. The flu news from Molly's morning call came out over tea, when the kitchen was full and the light was going gold and the twins had apparently resolved whatever had happened in the shed well enough to be present and functional. "I spoke to Amelia this morning," Molly said, setting her teacup down with the particular precision that meant she was being careful about tone. "The temporary guardianship application will be reviewed at the end of the week. She's expediting it." "That's fast," Percy said. He had the warrant in front of him, fully read, thoroughly flagged. "The standard processing time is, Amelia is expediting it," Molly said. "Given the circumstances." "And Dumbledore?" Arthur asked. Molly looked at her husband, and the kitchen went a very particular kind of quiet, not anxious, but attentive. Harry noticed all of them do it, the slight still that moved through the table like a wave. "He's contacted the ministry," she said. "The blood ward argument, as expected. He hasn't contacted us yet directly, which I find interesting." "He'll come," Arthur said. "Yes," Molly agreed. "He'll come." She looked around the table, at Harry specifically, and then at all of them. "When he does, we'll be ready. But for now," she picked her teacup back up, "for now he can wait. We're having tea." Harry looked at the table. At the mismatched teacups and the plate of biscuits that Ron had, against all probability, actually managed to make look like biscuits, and the jam that was always on the table regardless of meal type, and Dobby sitting very correctly in a chair with a cup of tea that was too big for his hands but which he was managing with great dignity, and Ginny talking to Fred about something and Arthur reading parchment and Percy flagging warrant provisions and Ron stealing the last biscuit before anyone else could. "Harry," Fred said. He looked up. "You all right?" Fred asked. "Just that, no comedic delivery, no layering." "Yeah," Harry said. And then, because the table was full and the light was good and the ward magic had felt glad, "I really am." George raised his teacup very slightly and Fred raised his, and it was the smallest possible toast, barely a gesture, and Harry raised his too and they drank their tea. Outside the kitchen window, the field behind the garden was going golden in the late light, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked, and Molly said something to Arthur that made him laugh quietly, and the burrow held them all in its impossible crooked warmth, and Harry sat inside it and did not wait for the catch. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. Dumbledore arrived on a Thursday. Harry knew he was coming before anyone said anything, because the atmosphere in the burrow shifted in the way it shifted before weather, a subtle pressure change, everyone slightly more deliberate in how they moved and what they said. Molly made a larger breakfast than usual and didn't comment on it. Arthur came home from the ministry at lunch instead of the evening and spent an hour with Percy going through parchment in the garden. The twins were, for the first time since Harry had arrived, genuinely quiet in the morning. Harry noticed all of this from the field behind the garden, where he'd been since 8 o'clock, flying. He'd been flying every morning. Not because anyone told him to, but because the air was the one place he'd found in 11 years of living where his brain went properly quiet, where everything that needed sorting through could be left on the ground and he could just be a body moving through space at high speed. The broom was old and the left side pulled slightly on a strong crosswind, but he'd learned its habits and it had, he felt, learned something about his. He landed when he saw Arthur come through the garden gate and look up at him with an expression that wasn't urgency but was adjacent to it. "He'll be here at 2, Arthur said. Harry came down and stood in the grass with the broom across his shoulders, the way the Gryffindor team captain held it, and looked at Arthur. "Okay," he said. "You don't have to be in the room," Arthur said. "Molly and I will handle, I want to be there," Harry said. Arthur looked at him for a moment. Not assessing whether Harry was capable of it, something different. Like he was making sure Harry understood what he was saying. "It might be uncomfortable," Arthur said. "Most things are," Harry said. Arthur held his gaze for a second longer. Then he nodded, once, in the way that meant I heard you, and turned back toward the house. Harry stood in the field for another moment, the broom still across his shoulders, and looked at the sky. It was a clean blue, the kind of blue that didn't have any opinions. He liked that about skies. Then he went inside. At 1:55, Molly put the kettle on. At 2 o'clock exactly, the fireplace in the living room flared green, and Albus Dumbledore stepped through it in robes the color of deep water, shaking ash from his beard with the unhurried ease of a man who flooded into people's homes all the time and had long since made his peace with the undignified arrival method. He was tall. Harry always forgot how tall he was until he was in the same room with him. The half-moon glasses caught the light, and the silver beard was immaculate, and he carried the particular gravity of someone who had been the most important person in most rooms for so long that the rooms themselves seemed to know it. Harry was sitting on the window seat. He'd chosen it deliberately because it was slightly outside the main conversational triangle, the sofa, the armchair, Dumbledore wherever he landed, but still clearly present. Not peripheral. Present. Dumbledore looked at him when he came through, and something moved behind those very blue eyes, something complex that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite guilt, but had elements of all three. "Harry," he said. "You're looking well." "I'm eating properly," Harry said. "Makes a difference." A very small pause. Molly came through from the kitchen, and the temperature in the room went up by approximately 10 degrees, not warmth exactly, but the kind of charged air that happened when two weather systems met. "Albus," she said. "Tea." "Thank you, Molly." He sat down in the armchair, and it was done with such natural authority that Harry had to consciously recognize it as a choice, a deliberate claiming of the room's center. "I came as soon as I could." "It's been 4 days," Molly said, pleasantly, handing him the tea. "I was in the middle of several sensitive." "Yes," she said, and sat down on the sofa. Arthur sat next to Molly. Amelia Bones, who had arrived 45 minutes earlier through the same fireplace and was currently sitting in the corner of the room in a high-backed chair with a parchment folder across her knees, looked at Dumbledore over her monocle with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something to be said out loud for a long time and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for it to happen. Dumbledore looked at Amelia. Something behind the blue eyes sharpened slightly. "Amelia," he said. "I wasn't expecting." "No," she said. "You weren't." "A beat." "I see," he said. "I doubt it," she said, pleasantly. Harry watched this exchange with a quality of attention he usually reserved for chess with Ron, tracking the pieces, understanding what each move meant under the surface of what it looked like. Dumbledore set his tea down and looked at the room, at Molly and Arthur, at Amelia, at Harry on the window seat, and made a visible internal adjustment. He had come expecting to manage a situation, Harry could see that clearly, and he was recalibrating in real time with the ease of someone who was very experienced at recalibrating. "I understand," Dumbledore said, "that there are concerns about Harry's welfare at Privet Drive." "There are documented findings," Amelia said. "Concerns implies uncertainty. We have documentation." "Of course." A slight pause. "I want to say, first and most importantly, that I share those concerns, those findings, entirely. Harry's comfort and well-being are, Albus." Molly's voice was the quiet voice. Harry had heard it twice now, and both times it had the effect of making everyone in the room pay close attention. "I'd like you to not do that." Dumbledore looked at her. "I'm sorry." "I'd like you to not position yourself as someone who shares our concerns," she said. "Because you've known about the conditions at that house for at least a year, based on Agent Whitmore's notes, which mention a previous welfare notation filed in 1991 that was redirected from standard processing." She looked at Amelia briefly, who nodded, "and you've taken no action. So I'd appreciate it if we spoke plainly." The room was very still. Dumbledore's expression was, and Harry found himself watching it carefully, because it was doing something he hadn't expected. It wasn't offended. It wasn't defensive in the way Vernon's face got defensive, which was loud and puffed up and obvious. It was something quieter. Something that looked, underneath the long habit of authority and control, like a man who had been waiting for someone to say this to him directly and was discovering that waiting for it had not made it easier to hear. "You're right," he said. Harry blinked. Molly didn't blink. She waited. "I knew the conditions were not ideal," Dumbledore said. I have," he paused, and the pause was genuine, which was the thing about Dumbledore that Harry was finding most confusing. He'd expected something smoother. Something more political. "I made judgments about necessity versus comfort. About protection versus," he stopped again. He looked at Harry. "Versus what?" Harry said. The question came out more directly than he'd intended, but having said it, he didn't want to take it back. Dumbledore looked at him. "Versus happiness," he said. "I made a calculation, Harry, that the protection those wards provided was worth the cost of, I believe the Dursleys would." He stopped a third time, and each stop was the sound of a man finding that his reasons, spoken aloud, were not holding their shape. "You believe they would what?" Harry said. "Look after me." "I hoped," Dumbledore said, "that family would." "They put me in a cupboard," Harry said. "For 10 years. The words were very flat. Not angry, exactly, the anger was there but underneath, fueling the flatness rather than breaking through it. He'd found recently that flat was more effective than loud. The twins had taught him that without meaning to, the way the really good Fred and George lines were delivered with absolute calm. Dumbledore received this with the expression of a man accepting a weight. "Yes," he said. "They did. And you knew they weren't, you knew it wasn't good." Whitmore filed a notation in 1991. "I was made aware of the notation, yes. And nothing changed." A pause. "No," Dumbledore said. "Nothing changed." Harry looked at him. He looked at the most powerful wizard in Britain sitting in the Weasleys' living room armchair with his tea going cold and his reasons dissolving in the air between them, and he felt something clarify inside him, not resolution, not forgiveness, not anger fully expressed. Something cleaner than all of those. The satisfaction of looking at a thing directly. "Right," Harry said. "I want you to understand," Dumbledore began. "The Blood Ward argument," Amelia said, from her chair in the corner, in the tone of a woman redirecting a meeting that was beginning to drift from its agenda. "Since I expect that's next." Dumbledore looked at her. He reassembled himself slightly, the authority settling back around him like a robe. "The Blood Ward is a legitimate concern, Amelia. The protection it provides Harry is, genuinely significant," she agreed. "I've read the magical theory. I've also had 3 cursebreakers from Gringotts and our own specialist in ancient protections look at the ward structure this week." She opened her folder and produced a single sheet. "Their consensus is that the Blood Ward requires Harry to return to Privet Drive at minimum once per year for a period of no less than 1 night in order to maintain the ward's integrity. It does not require him to live there. It does not require him to be housed there for 3 months of every year. It requires 1 night." She set the sheet on the table. "Which is, coincidentally, entirely compatible with him living with the Weasleys." The silence that followed had texture. Dumbledore looked at the sheet. He looked at it for long enough that Harry understood it was not new information, that Dumbledore had known this, or had known it was knowable, and had chosen a wider interpretation of the ward's requirements for reasons that, said out loud in this room, would sound exactly like what they were. "The wards are stronger," Dumbledore said, carefully, "when Harry's presence at Privet Drive is more sustained." "The magical saturation of, marginally stronger," Amelia said. 3% stronger, per the Cursebreaker's assessment, for each additional month of residence. The baseline protection from 1 night per year is robust enough to deflect any standard dark object or curse that a Death Eater might deploy." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate marginal improvements in protective magic as much as anyone, Albus. But a 3% improvement in curse deflection does not override the Child Magical Welfare Act. That's not how the Act works. There is no clause that says unless the marginal magical benefit is sufficiently significant. There is no such clause because the act was specifically written without it. Arthur said, quietly, "Who wrote the act, Albus?" A pause. "I did," Dumbledore said. "In 1973, Arthur said. "When you were Chief Warlock." Another pause. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "So," Arthur said, with the very mild tone of a man who had done his research and was letting it do the work for him, "you wrote an act without a greater good exemption, and then you made a guardianship arrangement for Harry that relied on a greater good exemption that you had specifically declined to include in the act." Dumbledore looked at Arthur Weasley, gentle, endlessly curious, frequently underestimated Arthur Weasley, with an expression that Harry recognized as genuine respect and something complicated underneath it. "You've been doing your homework," Dumbledore said. "I work in the ministry," Arthur said pleasantly. "I read things." The argument about the blood wards lasted another 20 minutes, and Amelia Bones won it so thoroughly and so quietly that Harry almost felt sorry for Dumbledore. Almost. She had documentation for every point and she deployed it with the calm efficiency of a person who respected good argument and expected it in return, and what became apparent over the course of those 20 minutes was that Dumbledore had no counter-argument that could survive contact with the act he'd written himself. At the end of it, Dumbledore set his cold tea down and was quiet for a moment. "The guardianship application," he said. "You're supporting it, Amelia?" "I filed it myself," she said. "Joint application with Molly and Arthur Weasley as temporary guardians, pending review. Given the documentation, I expect it will be approved before the weekend." Dumbledore nodded slowly. He looked at Molly. "The blood ward requirement, the yearly visit, 1 night, Molly said. He can manage 1 night. "I want to be clear," Dumbledore said, and his voice had shifted, it was quieter now, and had shed most of its political quality, and what was underneath was something older and more genuine and, Harry thought, more honest than anything he'd said since he arrived, "that Harry's safety from Voldemort remains my primary, his safety from the Dursleys was also relevant," Molly said. "Yes." Dumbledore accepted this like he was accepting a physical object. "Yes, it was. And he looked at Harry again. There was something in those blue eyes that had been there since he'd walked through the Fleur but was only now surfacing fully, something that Harry couldn't quite name, because it was the expression of a very old man who had made a very long series of calculations and was sitting in the living room of a crooked house in Devon discovering that he'd miscounted somewhere. "I am sorry, Harry," he said. And this was not the political apology, the managed acknowledgement of a misstep. It was the other kind. The kind that came without qualifications attached. "I am sorry for what you endured, and I am sorry that I allowed it to continue, and I am sorry that I was not honest with you about what I knew and why I made the choices I made." Harry looked at him. The thing was, he believed him. That was the complicated part. He looked at Albus Dumbledore and saw someone who was genuinely sorry, and also saw someone who had been genuinely certain, for years, that his certainty justified everything it cost other people. Those two things were both true at once and he didn't quite know what to do with them side by side. "Okay," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "That doesn't mean everything's fine," Harry said. "But I believe you're sorry." "So, okay." Something moved through the room. Amelia Bones was looking at Harry with an expression that was not quite surprise but was something adjacent to it. Molly was very still. Arthur had a look on his face that Harry had seen him get at the Muggle artifacts in his shed, the expression of someone encountering something that worked in a way they hadn't expected. "Thank you," Dumbledore said. It came out quietly, like he meant it. "I want to know things," Harry said. "Going forward. About my parents, about the wards, about," he stopped and pulled in a breath, "about why Voldemort tried to kill me when I was a baby. I want actual answers, not," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "not managed information. Not you're too young or in time or when the moment is right." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. "That's fair," he said. "Some of what I need to tell you is, he paused, it carries weight. I want to be thoughtful about when and how. Being thoughtful about when and how is fine, Harry said. As long as it actually happens. It will, Dumbledore said. Harry held his gaze for a moment, reading it. He was 11, and Dumbledore was 110 or something, and it should have been a ridiculous conversation for them to be having. But it wasn't, and the reason it wasn't was sitting somewhere in the space that Privet Drive had created, 10 years of being managed and redirected and told things were for his own good, which had given him a very precise detector for when someone was telling him the truth versus when they were constructing a version of it. Dumbledore was telling the truth. Okay, Harry said again. Dumbledore stayed for another hour. He and Amelia worked through the formal aspects, the warrant, the guardianship, the yearly visit schedule, with the professional ease of two people who had collaborated for decades and knew how to disagree without losing the working relationship. Harry stayed on the window seat for most of it, not contributing much, but listening to everything. He listened to Dumbledore describing the ward structure in technical detail, the way Lily's sacrifice had been woven into the blood protection, the precise mechanism by which Petunia's grudging acceptance had served as the anchor. He listened to Amelia probing the technical claims with the questions of someone who'd already consulted 3 specialists. He listened to Arthur, very quietly, asking the question nobody else had asked yet, whether the decision to place Harry with the Dursleys specifically had been based on magical necessity or on a desire to keep Harry away from the wizarding world until he was old enough to be introduced on Dumbledore's terms. The silence before Dumbledore answered that question was the longest one in the room. Both, he said, finally. Arthur nodded, as if he'd expected this. Molly looked at the window. Amelia wrote something in her folder. I wanted, Dumbledore said, with the careful precision of someone dismantling something they'd built, Harry to arrive at Hogwarts without the weight of his own legend. Without the expectations. I thought the Dursleys, he stopped. I thought distance from our world would protect him from becoming what people expected him to be. And instead, Molly said, very quietly, he arrived at Hogwarts not knowing he could ask to use the loo. The room absorbed this. Dumbledore looked at Molly Weasley, at this woman in her good burgundy robes with her hands folded in her lap and her voice perfectly level, and something in his expression was the expression of someone finally hearing a thing they should have heard years ago. Yes, he said. I got that wrong. Yes, she agreed. You did. The simplicity of it was the thing. No elaboration required. Dumbledore left at 4 o'clock, standing in the fireplace, and paused before he threw the powder. He looked at Harry. I meant what I said, he said. Real answers. When you want them. I'll hold you to that, Harry said. Dumbledore almost smiled. I expect you will. He threw the powder, said Hogwarts, and was gone. The green flames died back. Amelia was already packing her folder with the efficient precision of someone whose afternoon had gone exactly as she'd managed it. Guardianship should be through by Friday, she said to Molly. I'll send a Patronus when it's confirmed. She stood, straightened her robes, and looked at Harry with the direct, evaluating look she'd worn for most of the afternoon. You did well, she said. He had the strong impression she didn't say this often. I just asked questions, he said. She said, in the tone that meant she thought he'd done something more than that but wasn't going to elaborate. She shook Molly's hand, shook Arthur's, nodded to Harry, and fled away. The living room was quiet. Then Fred's voice came from the direction of the stairs, Is it over? Were you listening the whole time? Molly asked. No. Fred. We were in the kitchen, George said, from slightly further away, which meant he'd moved when she'd started speaking. Doing very quiet kitchen things. Come down, Molly said. They came down, and Ron and Ginny were behind them, which meant all 4 of them had been in the kitchen together, which meant Ron and Ginny had been doing their very quiet kitchen things alongside the twins, which meant the entire Weasley household had been listening through the wall. Harry looked at this situation and found he didn't mind it at all. Well? Ron said. Guardianship is through on Friday, Harry said. Dumbledore agreed to the Blood Ward compromise. One night a year. Ron's expression cycled through several states. That's it? Done. Done, Harry said. Brilliant. Ron sat on the sofa with the energy of a man deflating a very long tension. Right. Can we have dinner? I've been too anxious to eat since noon. You ate 4 biscuits at lunch, George said. Anxiety eating, Ron said. Different. Sit down, Molly said, to all of them, in the warm voice, the ordinary one, the everyday one. I'll start dinner. She went to the kitchen, and Arthur followed her, and the twins immediately started an argument about something that had clearly been on hold all afternoon, and Ginny sat next to Harry on the window seat. You all right? She asked. He thought about Dumbledore saying I am sorry and meaning it. He thought about Amelia Bones putting 3 Cursebreaker reports in a folder and taking them into a room. He thought about Molly saying he arrived not knowing he could ask to use the loo in a voice that left no room for argument because it didn't need any. Yeah, he said. He meant it differently each time he said it, he'd noticed. This time he meant it the way you meant something when it had passed through a complicated place to get there and arrived on the other side still standing. He looked older when he left, Ginny said. Dumbledore. Like something got heavier. Harry considered this. Maybe it was already heavy and he'd been putting it somewhere else. Ginny looked at him. That's a very specific way of putting it. I've been putting things places else for a while, he said. You get to recognize it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the garden was going long-shadowed in the late light, the gnomes doing their usual territorial survey of the flower beds, the washing on the line moving in a small evening wind. It gets lighter, she said. When you stop putting it places. He wasn't sure if she was speaking from experience or instinct. He thought, probably, both. I'm starting to think so, he said. Percy found him after dinner. This was unexpected enough that Harry, who was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning Hedwig's feathers with the small kit he kept in his trunk, looked up with the automatic wariness of someone enthused to Percy Weasley seeking him out one-on-one. Percy sat down across from him with the warrant, still flagged, and a fresh parchment. He had his reading glasses on, which he only ever wore when he was doing something he considered seriously official. I want to make sure you understand the legal protections this gives you, Percy said, spreading the warrant on the table between them. He had the manner of someone who had been preparing this explanation for several days and was pleased to finally have the opportunity to deliver it. The temporary guardianship, once confirmed, means that any decision about your welfare, housing, schooling, medical care, requires my parents' consent. Dumbledore cannot unilaterally decide to move you back to Privet Drive. The Dursleys cannot apply to have the guardianship reversed without a full Wisengamot hearing, which, he turned to his fresh parchment and pointed to a line, given the Whitmore report and the inquiry findings, would be extremely difficult for them to succeed in. Harry looked at the parchment and then at Percy. Did you research all of this today? Since yesterday, Percy said. When I found out you were here. He adjusted his glasses, which was the Percy equivalent of looking slightly embarrassed. I wanted to understand it properly. Thank you, Harry said. There's more, Percy said, not deflecting the thanks exactly but moving past it efficiently, in the way Percy moved past things. The DMLE inquiry into the Dursleys is ongoing. The findings will determine whether criminal charges are brought. Muggle neglect protocols may also be triggered through Squib liaison services, which, he glanced at Harry, means that even if the magical investigation concludes, there is a separate Muggle social services process that can proceed independently. He set his quill down. They cannot simply wait this out. This doesn't go away. Harry looked at the warrant spread between them on the table, with its burgundy wax seal and its 4 pages of careful language. He thought about it sitting in a drawer at Privet Drive, never existing, and him not knowing it could exist. Percy, he said. Can I ask you something? Yes, Percy said, in the tone of someone who always said yes to questions because they found questions more comfortable than most social interactions. Did you know? Before this week. About what it was like there. Percy was quiet for a moment, adjusting and readjusting his quill. I knew what Ron said, he said, carefully. I knew what I observed when Fred and George went to collect you in the flying Ford Anglia. He paused. The bars on the window. The locks. I told myself there was a reason. That Dumbledore had, he stopped. I told myself the things I needed to tell myself, he said, simply, and this was the most honest thing Harry had ever heard Percy say, and he suspected it was the most honest thing Percy had said to anyone about this. Yeah, Harry said. Most people did. That doesn't make it acceptable, Percy said. No, Harry agreed. But it's different from not caring. Percy looked at him with the expression of someone trying to determine if he'd just been forgiven something he hadn't asked for forgiveness for, and not quite knowing how to process that. For what it's worth, Percy said, I intend to continue monitoring the inquiry documentation and ensuring that the legal protections here remain current and properly understood. He folded the warrant carefully and slid it back across the table. You should keep this copy. Harry picked it up. Thank you, Percy. Percy stood, straightened his robes, pushed his glasses up. Yes, well. He turned to leave, stopped, turned back. I flagged a clause on page 3, he said. Section 12b. It's the provision about the minor's right to legal consultation with an independent advocate. You're entitled to that, separately from my parents, if you ever, he paused. If you ever need it. Your own representative. Harry looked at the flagged page. At the small precise flag and the pencil annotation in Percy's handwriting, H, this is yours independently. Okay, he said. Percy nodded and left, and his footsteps went upstairs with the measured regularity of someone who moved through the world exactly as deliberately as he intended. Harry sat at the kitchen table with the warrant and Hedwig warm and solid on his shoulder and the sounds of the burrow around him, Fred and George's voices from somewhere, the wireless, water running, Molly saying something to Arthur in the low warm register she used when they were alone. He looked at the flag on page 3. This is yours independently. He thought about Dumbledore's face when the reasons had stopped holding their shape. He thought about Amelia Bones with 3 Cursebreaker reports. He thought about Molly saying one night a year like it was the most obvious conclusion in the world. He thought about Percy researching since yesterday because he wanted to understand it properly. He thought about all the machinery that had moved this week, quietly, deliberately, in his direction, and felt, for the first time since any of it had started, not rescued. Protected. Which was different, he was beginning to understand, in ways that mattered quite a lot. He put the warrant in his trunk that evening, folded along Percy's crease, flag intact. He put it at the top, under the photo album, where he'd be able to find it easily. Then he went back downstairs for the evening, because Molly was making cocoa and Ron had set up the chess board and the twins were doing something in the corner that smelled interesting and faintly dangerous, and the burrow was warm and impossible and entirely real. He went into all of that without pausing at the threshold. Chapter 5, What Harry Does with Anger. The guardianship came through on Friday, as Amelia had promised. Molly's Patronus, a large silver otter that arrived in the kitchen while Harry was eating toast, delivered the news in Amelia's clipped voice, confirmed. Filed. Binding as of 9 this morning. Copies to follow by Owl. The otter dissolved in a scatter of silver light and Molly set her tea down and breathed out slowly, and that was that. Ron thumped Harry on the shoulder hard enough to knock him sideways. The twins appeared from nowhere, as they did, and George picked Harry up off the bench entirely, and Arthur said wonderful 4 times in a row with increasing quiet sincerity, the way he said things he really meant. Percy was already at the table with a fresh parchment, writing notes. Harry sat in the middle of all of it and felt the thing settle. Not excitement, exactly, something more fundamental. The specific weight of a thing becoming real. He'd been holding some part of himself ready to move, ready to be told it hadn't worked, ready for the catch, and now there was no catch and that readiness had nowhere to go and was slowly, with some reluctance, standing down. He ate his toast. Ginny came downstairs at 9:30, took one look at the kitchen, and said, "It went through." "This morning," Arthur confirmed. She looked at Harry. Just for a moment, a brief measuring look, and then she nodded, satisfied, and poured herself tea. "Good," she said. "Right. Fred, George, you owe me." "We absolutely do not," Fred started. "You bet me it wouldn't be through until next week." "We said probably not until, pay up." The kitchen descended into an argument about the precise language of whatever bet Ginny had made with the twins, and Harry listened to it with the particular pleasure of someone who had discovered that ordinary family noise was not in fact exhausting but was actually, in the right context, at the right temperature, one of the better sounds available. He went flying after breakfast, same as every morning. But today was different, and he knew it was different before he'd even pushed off the ground, because the thing that had been sitting in his chest since Privet Drive, the readiness, the held breath, was gone, and what was underneath it was something he hadn't been expecting. Anger. Clean, clear, properly calibrated anger. Not the formless anxiety-adjacent thing he'd been living in at the Dursleys, not the hot helpless frustration of being locked in and having no recourse. Something structural. Something that knew what it was about. He climbed high and fast over the field and let the air hit him and let the anger sit in his chest without trying to manage it, and found it was fine. It was just a thing he felt, the way the broom handle was just a thing he held. It had a shape and a weight and it didn't need to be anything other than what it was. He thought about 10 years in a cupboard. He thought about a stamp on an envelope. He thought about the word recipient used to describe a child who wasn't allowed to get letters. He thought about Dumbledore saying "I made a calculation" and the sound of reasons not holding their shape, and he thought about all of it directly, without the sideways glance and the quick redirect. He was angry about it. He was allowed to be angry about it. He tilted the broom into a dive that he pulled out of 20 feet above the gnome patch, and the speed was extraordinary, and below him the burrow's impossible roofline was warm in the morning sun, and he thought, "Good. Stay angry. It's true." He landed when he heard Fred calling him from the garden. "Right," Fred said, when Harry came through the gate. He had the look he got when he'd been thinking about something for several days and had arrived at a plan. George was next to him with the same look, which was how you knew it was serious. They planned separately and then confirmed, so when they had the same look simultaneously it meant they'd reached the same conclusion independently. "What?" Harry said. "We want to show you something," George said. "Is it dangerous?" Harry asked. "Define dangerous," Fred said. "For me specifically." "Probably not," George said. "Probably." Harry looked at them. "Okay." They took him to the shed. Arthur's shed was nominally a workspace for Muggle artifact research and had, over the years, also accumulated 3 broken broom handles, a set of cauldrons with varying degrees of structural integrity, a large box of fireworks that had been there since before Ron was born, several coils of rope with questionable enchantments, and in the back left corner, behind the cauldrons, a workbench that was clearly Fred and George's and had nothing whatsoever to do with Arthur's Muggle research. The workbench had 7 glass bottles on it, each containing something at a different stage of development. There were 2 notebooks, dense with handwriting and small diagrams. There was a safety screen propped against the back wall that had been scorched in 3 places. "Sit down," Fred said, gesturing to a stool with the authority of someone about to give a presentation. Harry sat. George picked up one of the bottles, amber-colored, something moving slowly inside it like heated honey, and held it up to the light. "Portable swamp," he said. "Early version. We've been working on it since March." "What does it do?" Harry asked. "Creates a temporary localized swamp," Fred said. "Approximately 3 square meters. Lasts about 6 hours. Self-contained, self-reverting." Harry looked at the bottle. "That's impressive." "Thank you," George said, setting it down with the careful precision of someone handling their own work. "We think so. But here's the thing," he picked up the second notebook and opened it to a middle page. "We've been trying to get the self-reverting mechanism to trigger on a timer rather than naturally, because natural reversion depends on ambient magic levels and those vary, and sometimes the swamp lasts 12 hours instead of 6, which is funny but inconvenient," Fred said. "Is funny but inconvenient," George confirmed. "We've tried 4 different timing charms, none of them reliable." He set the notebook down and looked at Harry. "Last Tuesday, when you came into the kitchen, Mum's teacup stopped wobbling." Harry looked between them. "The cup had been wobbling since the hinge on the cabinet got worn," Fred said. "Ron tried to summon it to steady it, nothing. Percy tried a stabilizing charm, it held for a day and then wobbled again. Mum just moved it to the corner where the wobble was, smaller. It's been there for 3 weeks. Then you walked in," George said. "Tired, half asleep, not doing anything intentional, and it stopped." "I didn't mean to, we know," Fred said. "That's the point." He leaned forward on the workbench. "The magic you do when you're not trying, it's got a quality to it. It doesn't argue with the existing enchantments, it just settles them. Like it finds the thing that's wrong and corrects it without making a production of it." Harry looked at the bottles on the workbench. "We want to see if you can do the same with the timing mechanism," George said. "Not cast a spell. Not try to do anything specific. Just look at the problem. Hold it. See what happens." Harry was quiet for a moment. "What if nothing happens?" "Then nothing happens," Fred said, simply. "We're not expecting anything. We're curious." The thing about Fred and George, Harry had found over the week, was that their curiosity was genuine and unpretentious. They were interested in things the way you were interested in things when you hadn't been told what to think about them first. They looked at Harry not with the weight of the boy who lived, not with Dumbledore's managed expectations or Ron's occasional off-flavored guilt, but with the same professional attention they gave the bottles on their workbench. It was, he found, enormously comfortable. "Show me the timing mechanism," he said. George had it on a separate piece of parchment, the charm sequence, with the problem annotated in the margin in red ink. The issue was what George called a synchronization gap. 2 parts of the charm were supposed to activate sequentially, but the second part kept reading the magical environment before the first part had fully set, which meant it was timing itself against an incomplete baseline and the whole thing ran inconsistently. Harry looked at the parchment. He was not good at theoretical magic yet, he knew this. His marks in history of magic were adequate and his charms theory was improving, but he was 11 and had been doing magic for less than a year. He understood maybe 30% of the technical language in George's annotation. But he looked at it the way he looked at a snitch before he'd spotted it, not scanning, just being receptive. Letting his eyes rest on the whole thing rather than the parts. He picked up Fred's quill and, without quite deciding to, drew a single connecting line between the 2 gaps in the sequence. Not a new charm. Not a modification. Just a line, indicating that the second part should wait, actually wait, a breath of suspended intention, for the first part to finish. Fred and George both looked at the parchment. "Ha," Fred said. "That's not a charm notation," George said. "I know," Harry said. "It's just, there's a gap. The second part needs to wait. It's trying to happen while the first part is still going, that's why it's miscounting. If you could put something in between that just pauses, a suspendio," George said, immediately. He looked at Fred. "A micro-suspendio between the activation steps." "That would work," Fred said, in the tone of someone annoyed they hadn't thought of it. "That's so obvious, why didn't we were looking at the charms," George said. "We weren't looking at the gap." He looked at Harry. "How did you see the gap?" Fred asked. Harry shrugged. He genuinely didn't know. He'd just looked at it and the gap was there, obvious as a missing step in a staircase. "Right," Fred said. He picked up a quill and began writing rapidly. We're testing this today. After lunch, George said. Obviously after lunch. I'm not blowing up the shed on an empty stomach. Fred looked at Harry over the notebook. You're staying for the test. It wasn't a question, which Harry appreciated. Yeah, he said. Obviously. They tested it after lunch, with everyone else strongly encouraged to be elsewhere, which in practice meant Ron and Ginny were standing at the garden gate watching from a distance and Percy was visible in the upstairs window with what was definitely binoculars. The first version of the modified portable swamp fizzed, produced a smell like pond water and gunpowder, and then sat still in the bottom of the test cauldron doing nothing. George said. Suspendio's too long, Fred said. It's pausing and then the second activation forgets what it was doing. Shorter pause, Harry said. How short? Harry thought about it. He thought about a breath. Specifically the beat between an exhale and the next inhale, the moment that was neither. A half beat, he said. Like a rest in music. Not a pause. A rest. Fred and George looked at each other. He's describing a microsuspendio, George said. That's what I said, Fred said. You said microsuspendio and then wrote a full suspendio because you forgot the micro part. I didn't forget, fix it, Harry said, not unkindly. Fred fixed it. The second test produced a sound like a small thunderclap and then, starting at the center of the cauldron and moving outward in a slow, inexorable wave, a very convincing swamp. Green, murky, with actual reeds appearing at the edges and something that might have been a small frog blinking at them from a mud hillock. Oh, George said. Oh, Fred agreed, more reverently. The swamp sat in the test cauldron, entirely stable, entirely self-contained, and exactly as constructed. It was not doing anything unexpected. It was doing precisely what the charm sequence said it should do, in the order it was supposed to do it, and it was going to do it for exactly 6 hours. From the garden gate, Ron made a sound. Is that, Ginny said. Yes, George called back. Did you just, yes, Fred said. Harry helped, George added. From the upstairs window, Percy said nothing but the binoculars moved slightly. Harry looked at the swamp in the cauldron. He looked at it with the satisfaction of something solved, and underneath that with the specific satisfaction of having solved it by looking at the gap rather than the mechanism, by seeing the thing that was missing rather than the things that were present. He thought, I can do that. I've always been able to do that. He thought about the Sorting Hat saying not a bad mind and Hermione saying you have good instincts and McGonagall saying natural ability in that careful, measured way she had, and he thought about all of those things and let them land properly for once, without the automatic redirect. He had a good mind. He had good instincts. He was allowed to use them. Right, Fred said, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. We're putting you on the payroll. You don't have a payroll, Harry said. We will, George said, with complete certainty. That evening, after dinner, Harry found himself on the back garden wall again. It had become a place he went without deciding to, the stone warm from the afternoon sun even as the evening cooled, the view of the field and the sky and the distance, Hedwig absent because she was doing her own business somewhere. Ginny came and sat next to him again. She had her hair down this evening, still with bits of grass in it from wherever she'd been, and she sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching because the wall was narrow. The twins said you fixed their swamp, she said. I said where the gap was, he said. They fixed it. They said you saw the gap in about 30 seconds. It was obvious. Fred and George have been working on that timing mechanism since March, she said. It wasn't obvious to them. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the field. Can I ask you something, she said. Yeah. Do you know you're powerful? He looked at her. The directness of it surprised him, though it shouldn't have. Ginny Weasley delivered things straight. I don't think about it like that, he said. But you know, she said. You just don't say it. He thought about this honestly. He thought about catching the snitch his first time on a broom. He thought about the cup stopping wobbling. He thought about the glass at the zoo, which had disappeared and then come back, and he'd been ate and he'd been afraid afterward because it wasn't supposed to happen but it had felt natural. Immediate. Like breathing. I know something's there, he said, carefully. I don't know what to do with it yet. You don't have to do anything specific with it, she said. I watch you and you move through things like you already know the answer and you're just waiting for the question to catch up. He looked at her. She was looking at the field, her chin on her knees, very matter-of-fact about this. Most people are surprised by things, she said. You look like you're recognizing them. He thought about that for a while. He thought about Quirrell in first year, and the chess game, and every defense against the dark arts class that had felt like remembering rather than learning. He thought about the broom. My mum was apparently really good, he said. Magic-wise. Dumbledore said, he said she was exceptional. The thing with the wards. The sacrifice, he stopped. I think maybe some of that's in me somewhere. Not her sacrifice. Just, her way of doing things. Ginny was quiet for a moment. That's a nice way to think about it. It's what Dobby said, he said. About the ward magic being glad. It made me think, she put herself into those protections. Part of her is still in there, in the magic. Maybe part of her is in me, too, in the way I do things. Ginny looked at him, and her expression was one of the more complicated ones he'd seen on her face, which was saying something because Ginny Weasley's face was rarely simple. I think that's true, she said, quietly. They sat there for a while in the cooling evening, and the field went darker and the stars came out one at a time and Hedwig appeared silently from the direction of the trees and landed on Harry's shoulder and looked at the sky with an air of professional assessment. Can I come flying tomorrow? Ginny said. Yeah, obviously, Harry said. She looked at him sideways. I'm good, you know. On a broom. Ron mentioned it. Ron said I was decent, she said, with enormous disgust. Harry nearly smiled. You might have to show me what decent looks like. I absolutely will, she said. He woke at 2 a.m. Not from a nightmare, he'd been sleeping well, the camp bed and the Ron-adjacent snoring having combined to produce something he could only describe as genuinely restful. He woke from nothing, just, awake, alert, the way he sometimes went from asleep to completely present without a transition. He lay still and listened. The house was quiet. Outside, something was moving in the garden, small sounds, rhythmic, not alarming. He lay there for a while and then, because he was awake and was going to stay awake, he got up, put his glasses on, and went downstairs. The kitchen was lit by the very low ember light of the fire kept overnight, and Molly was at the table. She had a cup of tea and a letter. She was not reading the letter, it was on the table in front of her, open, and she was looking at it with the expression of someone who had finished reading it a while ago and was now existing near it, which was different. She looked up when Harry came in. Can't sleep? She asked, in the quiet voice people used at 2 a.m. so they didn't disturb the quality of the dark. Just awake, he said. What is it? She looked at the letter, then at him. She picked it up and held it out. He took it and read it standing in the kitchen doorway in the ember light. It was from the inquiry, formal, ministry-headed, from the subcommittee Amelia had convened. 3 paragraphs of careful language that said, under the formality, the DMLE had reviewed the findings, the Dursleys were being referred for a full Wisengamot hearing, and separately the Muggle Social Services liaison had been notified and an independent Muggle investigation was opening. The 4th paragraph said that the inquiry had also reviewed the original guardianship placement, specifically, the decision-making process and who had been consulted, and who had not, and that Albus Dumbledore had been invited to submit a formal accounting of the 1981 guardianship decision to the committee. Harry read this paragraph twice. He set the letter down on the table. He'll have to explain it, he said. In writing. Officially. Yes, Molly said. He sat down across from her. He thought about Dumbledore saying I made a calculation and the calculation being explained into a document that would sit in Amelia Bones's file under Potter, forever. Are you glad? He asked her. Not about the Dursleys, about Dumbledore. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked at him with the direct, considering look she used when she was deciding how honest to be. I'm glad the process is happening, she said. I'm not glad Albus made the decisions he made. I'm not glad that you were in that house for 10 years while people deferred to his judgment. I'm not glad that I was one of those people for longer than I should have been. She paused. But I'm not angry at him the way I was on Tuesday. I'm something else. What? He said. Disappointed, she said. Which is worse, I think, because it means I expected better. Harry looked at the letter on the table. He is better than what he did, he said. I think he's capable of better. He just made a calculation and kept making it. Yes, she said. The tragedy of very intelligent people is sometimes that they trust their own calculations too much. Harry sat with this. The fire ticked. Somewhere outside a fox was doing something in the garden, and Hedwig came to the kitchen window, looked through the glass at Harry with an expression of mild inquiry, and then departed again, having apparently determined that the situation was adequately in hand. I'm angry, Harry said. About the 10 years. I wanted to say that. I'm not consumed by it, but I am. I want to put it somewhere accurate. Molly looked at him across the table in the low firelight. You can be as angry as it warrants, she said. It warrants quite a lot. Yeah, he said. And then, whenever you're ready and not before, you can decide what to do with it. She paused. Not because it needs to go away. But because anger that knows where to go is more useful than anger that just stays. He thought about the swamp. The gap. The thing that was needed was not more mechanism but a beat of clear intention between the parts, so the second part knew where the first part had left off. I think I'm figuring out where to put it, he said. She smiled at him, the warm, full smile, the one that reached her eyes completely. Good, she said. Tea. Yeah, he said. Please. She got up and put the kettle on, and they sat in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with the fire low and the house quiet around them, and the letter from the inquiry was on the table between them, and Harry drank his tea and let the anger sit where it was, correctly placed, correctly shaped, not going anywhere it hadn't been told to go. Saturday morning arrived with rain and a mood that suited it. The kind of steady, purposeful summer rain that meant indoor things. Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Ginny were in the sitting room, and the twins had produced a truly alarming quantity of materials from the shed, the notebooks, 3 new prototype bottles, a roll of parchment, and 2 boxes of something that was either confectionery or an accelerant and possibly both. Right, Fred said, settling cross-legged on the floor with his notebook. We need to test the swamp version in a bigger space. Garden's wet, shed's too small. We need a contained indoor test environment. That's not what this room is, Ron said. It's what it is now, George said. Mum has gone to the village and won't be back until noon, Fred said. Percy's in his room reading something about ministry ethics, which will keep him occupied for hours. Dad's at the ministry. We have until noon. What are we testing? Harry asked. We've got 3 prototypes, George said, lining the bottles up on the floor. The swamp's the working one. We've also got, he pointed to a green bottle, an early version of what we're calling an extendable ear. Basically a charm that lets you hear through walls. We know they work, Fred said. The problem is they tangle. They what? Harry asked. When you deploy more than one, they get confused about which ear is which, George said. Like they're trying to share the same frequency. You end up hearing both conversations at once. Which is occasionally useful, Fred said. But not the design intention, George said. We need them to be individually addressable. Like, each one should only report back to its own paired receiver. Harry picked up the green bottle. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the timing mechanism parchment, not trying to solve it, just receiving it. They need names, he said. Everyone looked at him. Not like, actual names, he said. But each one needs a unique identifier baked into the charm so they can tell themselves apart. Like initials on your school robes, so the laundry knows whose is whose. Fred looked at George. George looked at Fred. A signature charm, George said. Built in at activation, Fred said. So when you deploy them, you say, George thought rapidly, you say a specific key phrase or name, and that becomes its identifier, and it only reports back to the receiver that was activated with the same, yes, Harry said. Ginny, who had been sitting on the sofa watching all of this with her knees up and her chin on them, said, Harry, how are you doing this? Doing what? You've been here for 6 days, she said. And you've fixed their timing mechanism and now I'm not fixing anything, Harry said. I'm just saying what seems obvious. It's not obvious, Ron said. I've been hearing about the ear problem for 2 months and I couldn't. You're not looking at the gap, Harry said, and then felt slightly odd about how that sounded. What gap? Ron said. Harry tried to think about how to explain it. When you look at a problem, you look at the thing that's there, he said. The mechanism, the charm, whatever. I look at the thing that's not there. The space between the parts. Usually the problem lives in that space, not in the parts themselves. The room was quiet for a moment. That's a very Fred and George way of thinking, Ginny said, sounding surprised. Thank you, Fred said, with enormous sincerity. It wasn't entirely a compliment, Ginny said. Still taking it, Fred said. They spent the morning testing the extendable ear with signatures built in, and it worked on the 3rd try, each ear reporting cleanly to its own receiver, no tangling, and the range was extraordinary. From the sitting room Fred could hear Percy upstairs saying something about procurement ethics to no one, which was either him reading aloud or an ongoing internal monologue and was equally plausible. The swamp test went better than the shed test. The cauldron version scaled up correctly, occupying a precise 3 square meters of sitting room floor, and Ginny walked directly into it, which was either an accident or a deliberate test of the depth and Harry thought probably the latter, and it was mid-calf deep and smelled like genuine swamp, and the frog appeared again and looked at Ginny with great self-possession. Hello, Ginny said to the frog. The frog blinked. I think it's the same frog, George said. It is not the same frog, Fred said. It has the same energy, George said. Ginny picked the frog up. It sat in her palm with the dignity of something that had accepted its circumstances. Harry looked at the swamp in the sitting room, 3 square meters of working, timed, self-reverting swamp, produced by 2 16-year-olds working from handwritten notebooks in a garden shed, and he thought about Amelia Bones saying watch this one in whatever tone she'd used, and he thought, not just me. You know, he said, to Fred and George, when we open the shop, Fred said, pleased by the certainty of it. It's going to be incredible, Harry said. They looked at him. Not the performance, not the twin comedy. Both of them looking at him, straight, the way they'd looked at the swamp. Yeah, George said. Quietly. It is. The rain came down on the burrow and the swamp sat in 3 square meters of the sitting room and the frog sat in Ginny's palm and Ron was laughing at something Fred had just said and Harry sat cross-legged on the floor with a prototype bottle in his hand, looking at the gaps in things and finding them, and feeling, not happy exactly, because happy was a word he was still learning the full dimensions of. Something more durable than happy. Something with roots. Molly came home at noon and walked into the sitting room and looked at the swamp for a long moment. Everyone was very still. She looked at Fred. She looked at George. She looked at Harry, whose expression had developed into something involuntarily guilty. It reverts in 6 hours, George said. 4.5, now, Fred said. The frog is, Ginny started. Do not, Molly said, tell me about the frog. Okay, Ginny said. Molly looked at the swamp for another moment. Then she looked at Harry specifically, and her expression did the thing it did when she was deciding what to make of something. Did it work correctly? She asked him. He blinked. Yeah. The timing mechanism held. She nodded. Good, she said, and went to the kitchen to start lunch, and the room exploded into laughter, and the frog blinked at all of them with immense patience, and Harry laughed until his chest hurt in the best way. He'd never done that before, laughed until his chest hurt in the best way. He made a note of it, somewhere internal, the way he made notes of gaps. He thought, there's more of this. There's going to be more of this. He was not afraid of that. Chapter 6, Before the term begins. The owl arrived on a Monday. Not Hedwig, a ministry owl, broad-shouldered and official, arriving at the kitchen window just as Harry was finishing his second bowl of Molly's porridge. It landed on the windowsill with the particular self-importance of government correspondence and extended its leg with an air of having better places to be. Harry took the letter. It was from the Wisengamot Inquiry Committee, addressed to him directly, not to Molly, not to Arthur, to Harry James Potter, care of the Borough, Ottery Street Catchpole, and the addressee line had a weight to it that he sat with for a moment before opening it. He read it once quickly and then again slowly. The Dursleys had been issued formal charges under the Child Magical Welfare Act. The Muggle Social Services investigation, running parallel through Squib liaison channels, had produced findings consistent with the DMLE inquiry. Vernon Dursley had, according to the letter's careful language, elected to cooperate with proceedings rather than contest them, which the committee noted would be considered in the eventual determination. Petunia Dursley had submitted a written statement independently of her husband's, which the letter indicated was being reviewed separately. The last paragraph said that Harry was entitled to submit his own statement, if he chose to. That his account was not required, the case did not depend on it, but that it was his right to have his experience formally on record. The committee would accept a statement in writing, or he could appear before them in person, or he could decline entirely. All three options, the letter was careful to say, were valid. He put the letter down on the table. Molly was at the stove. She'd seen the owl and was waiting, doing the thing she did where she gave him space to process without making the processing about her presence. The Dursleys are being charged, he said. She turned around. Vernon is cooperating, he said. Petunia submitted her own statement separately. He looked at the letter again. They want to know if I want to submit one. Molly sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him and waited. Do you think I should? He said. I think, she said carefully, that this is entirely and completely your decision. Not mine, not Albus's, not the committee's. Yours. I know, he said. But I want to know what you think. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking about it rather than managing her answer. He appreciated that about her. She thought before she spoke, and what came out was usually the real version. I think there's a difference between what the case needs and what you might need, she said. The case doesn't need your statement. It's strong without it. But you might, she paused, you might need to say it somewhere official. Where someone has to write it down and keep it. She met his eyes. Where it becomes permanently, undeniably part of the record. He thought about that. He thought about the stamp on his letter. Recipient may not receive correspondence. He thought about the specific quality of being told, implicitly and explicitly, for 10 years, that he was peripheral, that what happened to him was incidental, that his experience was not the kind that warranted official record. He picked up the letter. I'll write a statement, he said. She nodded, once. Then she got up and went back to the stove, and Ron came downstairs and took the remaining porridge, and the morning continued around him while Harry sat at the table and thought about how to say 10 years in a way that fit on parchment. He wrote 3 versions. The first was too long, every detail he could remember, which turned out to be quite a lot, arranged chronologically, trying to prove something. He read it back and it felt like an argument rather than an account. The second was too short. Half a page. The facts, nothing else. He read it back and it felt like someone had asked him to describe a painting and he'd said it was on a wall. The third one he wrote in the garden, sitting on the stone wall in the afternoon sun with Hedwig on his knee, and he wrote it by asking himself a single question: what do I want the record to say? Not what had happened, not a list of grievances, not an argument for consequences. What he wanted the permanent, undeniable record to say. He wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When he finished he read it through once, changed 2 words, and put it in an envelope. He didn't show it to anyone before he sent it. Not because it was secret, he'd have shown Molly if she'd asked, but because it was the first thing in a long time that had been entirely his, from start to seal, and he wanted to let it be that. Hedwig carried it to the ministry with the focused professionalism of an owl who understood the difference between ordinary post and something that mattered. He watched her go and felt the anger he'd been carrying rearrange itself slightly, not smaller, but different. More settled. Like it had found the place Molly had said it needed to find and sat down there. Tuesday arrived clear and warm and Arthur came home from work at lunch with 2 pieces of news and the expression of a man deciding which order to deliver them in. He sat down at the kitchen table where Molly was writing letters and Harry and Ron were playing chess. Harry was losing, which was the natural state of things when playing Ron, but he was losing more slowly than he had a week ago, which Ron found faintly alarming. "Right," Arthur said, sitting down and accepting the tea Molly passed him without being asked. "First thing. Dumbledore submitted his accounting to the inquiry committee this morning." Harry moved a night. Ron took it immediately and looked smug. "How long was it?" Harry asked. Arthur looked at him with the expression he got when Harry said something unexpectedly precise. 11 pages, he said. "Long," Molly observed. "Detailed," Arthur said. "Amelia sent a note." She said. He reached into his robe pocket and produced a folded scrap of parchment. She said, and I'm quoting, "The submission is thorough, self-critical to a degree that is either genuine or very well performed, and contains 3 specific admissions that I expect will be uncomfortable for him at the hearing. Tell Harry I read his statement. It was the right length." Harry looked at his chess pieces. He moved a bishop. "She read it," he said. "She read it," Arthur confirmed. Ron moved immediately, aggressively, and Harry lost a rook. He didn't particularly mind. "Second thing," Arthur said. He was now using the careful voice, the one he used when something had layers. "Vernon Dursley appeared before a Muggle magistrate this morning. Separately from the Wisengamot proceedings. Muggle charges, the social services investigation produced enough that the Muggle court could act independently." He paused. "The magistrate issued a community service order and a fine. The house has been flagged for continued social services monitoring. And," he looked at Harry directly, "Dudley Dursley has been referred to a Muggle child welfare support service." Harry sat with this. Dudley. He hadn't thought much about Dudley in all of this, which he recognized was probably significant. Dudley existed in his memory as a fact of life at Privet Drive, the primary instrument of 10 years of low-grade misery, Vernon's project, the boy with the second bedroom used for overflow toys. He'd never thought about what Dudley's version of growing up at number 4 had looked like from the inside. "Is he okay?" Harry said. "Dudley." Arthur looked at him. "I don't know specifically," he said. "The welfare service is just a check-in. Someone to talk to." Harry nodded slowly. He thought about a household built on fear and performance and the very specific meanness that came from people who were scared of things they didn't understand, and he thought about what it cost everyone inside that, not just him. All of them. "Good," he said. "That he's got someone." Molly was looking at him with an expression he'd seen once before, on the night she'd first let him eat the sandwiches without watching. Like she was witnessing something she was careful not to disturb. Ron said, very quietly, "Check." Harry looked at the board. He was in check and had been for 2 moves without noticing. He looked at his pieces, assessed the position, and moved his king sideways into the only clear square available. "You knew that square was safe," Ron said. "Yeah. You moved the rook 3 moves ago to make it safe." Harry looked at him. "You've been doing that," Ron said. "The whole game. You don't look like you're planning, but you are. You're 3 moves ahead and I keep thinking I'm winning, and then," he looked at the board, "you're not actually losing, are you?" Harry considered his position honestly. Ron had more pieces. Ron had positional advantage. But Harry had the king in the one safe square on the board, and the 2 pieces he still had were exactly placed. "I'm not winning yet," he said. "But you're not losing," Ron said. "I'm surviving until I can win," Harry said. Ron looked at the board for a long moment. Then he looked at Harry. "Yeah," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't about chess at all, and Harry let that be what it was without making it into a thing. Arthur watched all of this with the quiet pleasure of a man who had been in the business of paying attention to people for 25 years and found it continuously rewarding. "Lunch," Molly said, and that was the end of the chess game, and Harry's king was still standing. Diagon Alley on Thursday was Ron's idea, and Molly's organization, and Arthur's navigation through the leaky cauldron, and the twins' ongoing attempt to acquire as many new things as possible with the money they were theoretically saving for textbooks. Harry had been to Diagon Alley once before, last year, with Hagrid, for his Hogwarts supplies, and it had been overwhelming in the way of a first anything, too much at once. He'd been trying to absorb all of it while also buying quills and cauldrons and not showing how completely undone he was by the experience of a world that was real and was his. This time was different. He knew where he was going. He knew the shape of the cobbled street and the smell of it, something between a library and a kitchen and something outside both, and he knew the voices and the movement of it, the particular crowded warmth of magical commerce, and he walked into it with his hands in his pockets and looked around and felt like he belonged in it. He'd always belonged in it, of course. That was the point. He just hadn't always known it was allowed. Gringotts first, because Molly was practical about sequencing. The goblins were exactly as they'd been last year, not unfriendly, simply indifferent to anything that wasn't gold. And his vault was exactly as he'd left it, which was to say it had more gold in it than he knew what to do with, and he took enough for supplies and school and a modest buffer and didn't think too hard about the rest of it because there would be time for that later. He came out blinking in the sun and found the twins at the bottom of the steps, evaluating him. "How much?" Fred asked. "Enough," Harry said. "Define enough," George said. "More than I need for today," Harry said. "That's extremely unhelpful," Fred said. "Yes," Harry agreed. George looked at Fred. "I like him," George said. "I've always liked him," Fred said. "You've liked him for a week," George said. "I liked him before the week," Fred said. "I liked him the first time he came to our house. He looked at the gnomes like they were the best thing he'd ever seen." "The gnomes are objectively excellent," Harry said. "See," Fred said, to George. They went to Madame Malkin's first, because Harry needed clothes that actually fit, his size, his measurements, and the experience of standing in Madame Malkin's while she measured him and produced robes that went on his body and corresponded to the size of his actual body was one of those experiences that should have been entirely mundane and was instead, quietly, quite significant. He bought 3 sets of school robes. He also, at Molly's firm suggestion, bought 2 sets of ordinary clothes, trousers that fit at the waist, shirts with correct length sleeves, and the experience of wearing clothes that fit was so different from the oversized Dudley hand-me-down existence of his previous life that he stood in Madame Malkin's changing area for a moment just experiencing it. He came out and Ron said, "You look different." "Clothes that fit," Harry said. Ron nodded as though this was straightforward information. It was, in the way that water was straightforward, obvious and essential and something you didn't think about until you were without it. Ginny looked at him and then looked away at the street, very deliberately, and said something to Molly about new quills. Fred said, under his breath, composed. George, equally quiet, very. Harry bought a new quill for himself and a replacement ink bottle and 3 notebooks, not school issue, just his own, because he'd realized over the past week that he had things he wanted to write down that weren't homework, thoughts about magic and gaps and the shape of problems, and they needed somewhere to live. He bought a small sneakoscope for Ron, because Ron mentioned in passing that he'd always wanted one and Harry had the means to do something about that, and it felt good to spend his vault's gold on something that made his friend's face do what Ron's face did when Harry handed it to him in dervish and banjas. "You didn't have to," Ron started. "I know," Harry said. Ron looked at the sneakoscope. He looked at Harry. "Thanks," he said, in the way that meant a great deal more than the word. "Obviously," Harry said. They had lunch at the Leaky Cauldron, the whole Weasley group, plus Neville Longbottom and his grandmother who they encountered in the apothecary, and Neville sat next to Harry and told him about his summer in a gentle, meandering way that Harry found very pleasant. Neville was someone Harry hadn't thought about enough, quiet and kind and underestimated in a way Harry was starting to recognize, having been underestimated himself, and he made a note to be better about that in second year. "How's your summer been?" Neville asked him. Harry thought about the range of honest answers available. "Better than expected," he said. "A lot better." Neville smiled. "You're staying with the Weasleys?" "Yeah." Neville glanced down the table at Molly, who was arguing cheerfully with Arthur about something on the menu. "They're good people," he said. "My gran says Molly Weasley is one of the best witches she knows, even if she can be terrifying." "She's both of those things," Harry said, "and I think the terrifying part is most of the reason for the other part." Neville looked at him, surprised, and then laughed. It was a good laugh, a real one. After lunch Fred and George disappeared for 45 minutes and returned with bags that they refused to show anyone, and Percy bought a book on advanced transfiguration theory that he was clearly very excited about and equally clearly trying not to show, and Ginny spent careful time in Madame Malkin's for herself and came out looking like she'd made a decision about something. Harry walked back through Diagon Alley in the late afternoon gold light, school supplies expanded into his trunk via Molly's wand, and looked at the street, the wand shop, the apothecary, the robe shop, the owl post, the broomstick display in quality Quidditch supplies, and thought about how he'd walked this street last year not knowing whether he was allowed to want any of it, and how different it felt to walk it now. He wanted all of it. Specifically, deliberately, without apology. He was allowed. Friday arrived with Molly at the kitchen table very early, before anyone else was up, and Harry came downstairs at 6 and found her there with 2 letters and the expression of someone who had been sitting with something for a while and was ready to set it down. "From Petunia," she said, when he sat down. She said it carefully, watching him, giving him the option to not engage with it. He looked at the letters. 2, one clearly official, ministry seal, the other in handwriting he recognized from birthday cards he hadn't been allowed to open. "What does she say?" he asked. Molly slid the handwritten letter across to him. It was short. 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that Petunia had given her statement to the inquiry committee, and that it had been, in her words, a full and honest account. She didn't say what was in it. Harry thought he could probably guess. The second paragraph was the one that took him a moment to read. "I know that what I am saying does not undo what was done. I know it is not an explanation that is sufficient. But I want you to know that Lily was my sister, and that I knew, when I agreed to take you in, that there was more of her in you than just her blood. I was afraid of that, the same way I was afraid of her, the same way I was afraid of all of it, and fear made me mean in ways I am not proud of. You deserved better from the beginning. I think she would have found a way to tell you that if she could." Harry read it twice. He set it down on the table. Molly was watching him with the careful quality she had when she was letting him be exactly where he was without redirecting. "She's afraid of magic," he said. "She's always been afraid of it. I think she hated that she was afraid. So she made everything around it small and controlled instead of," he stopped. "Instead of asking for help," Molly said. "Yeah. Fear does that," she said. "It makes people very small and very mean, and the meanness feels like control. He sat with the letter for another moment. He thought about what he'd written in his own statement, the right length, Amelia had said, and he thought about Petunia sitting somewhere writing 2 paragraphs about Lily, and what it had cost her to write them. "I'm not going to forgive her yet," he said. "Not because I'm holding on to it. Just because it's not ready yet." "That's fine," Molly said. "Forgiveness isn't a thing you owe anyone on a schedule." "But maybe someday," he said. "Maybe someday," she agreed. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Not his trunk, not the warrant folder, his pocket, close, where things went when they needed more time. He reached for the official letter, the ministry one, and opened it. It was from Amelia Bones. Short, direct, Amelia's voice in every line. "Potter, statement received and filed. It is now part of the permanent inquiry record. The Wisengamot hearing for the Dursleys is scheduled for September 14th. Your presence is not required, but you are entitled to attend if you choose. Guardianship is confirmed, binding, reviewed annually. The Blood Ward visit schedule has been filed with the Ward Maintenance Office. First scheduled visit is July 31st next year, your birthday, which I note is a somewhat pointed choice on your part and which I found appropriate. One more thing. I have been in this department for 23 years. I have had 742 welfare cases cross my desk. I say the following as a professional observation with no expectation attached: watch what you become, Harry Potter. It is going to be worth watching. A. Bones, Director, DMLE. Harry read it 3 times. Each time the last paragraph did something slightly different to him. He set it on the table. "She said to watch what you become," Molly said. "Yeah," he said. "She's right," Molly said, simply, without ceremony. He looked at the kitchen around him, the mismatched mugs, the warm stove, the clock with all its hands pointing at home, the pile of Fred and George's notebook pages that had migrated to the kitchen table despite several attempts to remove them. He thought about a letter with a stamp on it. Recipient may not receive correspondence. He thought about a camp bed with the good sheets and a glass of water on the nightstand. He thought about Arthur in the shed and Amelia in her office and Percy with his flags and Ginny on the wall in the evening and Ron falling off his bed and the twins and the swamp and the frog and Dobby saying the wards felt glad. He thought about Lily Potter's magic being glad. He thought about sitting at the Burrow table 10 months ago, visiting, briefly, unknown, watching a family exist with the astonished expression of someone seeing a magic trick, and how different it was to sit at the same table now and be one of the things in it. "Molly," he said. She looked at him. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say. He'd been thinking about it for 2 days, since the guardianship came through, since the swamp test, since 2 in the morning with the low fire and the tea, and the shape of it was clear but the words kept being either too much or not enough. "I've never," he started. Stopped. Tried again. "Nobody's ever, I know," she said, quietly. "I want to say it properly," he said. "Not just thank you. Something that, Harry." She reached across the table and covered his hands with both of hers, the way she'd covered his hands in the hallway at Privet Drive when he'd gripped her arm. Just for a moment. Just the fact of it. "You're here," she said. "That's the thing. You're here." He breathed. He was here. He was here in the kitchen of the Burrow at 6 in the morning, legally, permanently, with documentation and guardianship papers and Amelia Bones's seal on everything, and there were people asleep upstairs who were going to come down in an hour and make noise about breakfast and argue about the marmalade, and in 3 weeks he was going to get on the Hogwarts Express and go back to school knowing, this time, exactly what he was coming back to. He was here and it was real and no one was going to take it apart. "Yeah," he said. "I am." He wrote the letter that afternoon. He'd been thinking about it since Amelia's note, the shape of a letter home, the specific word home, the deliberateness of using it. He sat in the garden on the stone wall with one of his new notebooks and a quill and he wrote it to no one and everyone, which was to say he wrote it to the people who would need to read it eventually, which was to say he wrote it to himself. Dear whoever finds this useful, he crossed that out. He started again. He wrote for an hour. He wrote about the warrant and the kitchen at 4 in the morning and the sandwiches and the porridge and the swamp and the chess game and the clothes that fit and Amelia's note. He wrote about anger that had found its place. He wrote about gaps, and how the thing inside a gap was usually the most important thing in the room. He wrote, I spent 10 years being told I was allowed only what was necessary. I am starting to understand that necessary is a much larger category than I was taught. He wrote, someone came for me. Before dawn. With documents. With authority. With the specific and deliberate intention of making something permanently different. I want to remember exactly what that felt like so I know how to do it for someone else eventually. He wrote, the burrow is crooked and loud and impossible and the clock has everyone's name on it and there is always jam on the table and I don't know what I've done to deserve it except be here and that turns out to be enough. He set the quill down. He looked at what he'd written. He looked at it the way he looked at gaps, not at the words themselves but at the space they described, the shape they made. Then he opened to a fresh page and wrote a proper letter. To Hermione, because school was starting in 3 weeks and she'd want to know, and because she was his friend and she deserved to know, and because he was learning that letting people know things was not the same as being exposed, that telling someone I am here and I am all right was not vulnerability but its opposite. He wrote her 4 paragraphs. He told her he'd been moved to the Weasleys, that it was a legal action, that he was fine, properly fine, not the deflective kind. He told her about Percy's annotated warrant. He told her about the swamp. He told her that he was looking forward to second year in a way he hadn't been looking forward to anything in recent memory, which was true. Hedwig appeared at his shoulder with the timing of someone who had been watching from a distance and knew when she was needed. He folded the letter and she took it with the careful grip of an owl who understood the value of a thing. He watched her go, southeast, toward the Granger's address he'd sent her to twice before, and felt the letter go with her like something sent forward, like a line cast ahead into the term. The night before the Hogwarts Express was a Weasley production. Trunks packed and repacked again because Fred claimed something of George's was in his trunk and George claimed the same and the twins' trunks were eventually found to each contain one of Percy's textbooks, which Percy received with the expression of a man who had long ago made his peace with being the most organized person in the household. Ron lost a sock for 45 minutes that turned out to be inside his sneakoscope, which was a specific kind of mystery. Ginny helped Harry organize his notebook pages without being asked, separating the ones that were ideas from the ones that were observations and the ones that were drawings, which she did with the focused competence of someone who had been organizing older brother's chaos her whole life. You draw? She said, looking at one of the pages. He glanced over. It was a sketch of the burrow from the garden wall, the roofline, the chimneys, the impossible angles. He'd done it without quite deciding to, the same way he'd drawn in the margins of his school notebooks at Privet Drive when there was nothing else to look at. He hadn't thought much about it. A bit, he said. It's good, she said. Not performing a compliment, just noting a fact. It's just the house, he said. It's exactly the house, she said. That's the hard part. She put it in the observations section, which felt right. He came down for the last evening to find the kitchen operating at full Weasley capacity, 8 people, 1 kitchen table, not enough chairs, Percy reading, the twins doing something with 2 of the new notebook pages that they put away when Molly looked at them, Ron and Arthur talking about Quidditch in the background register of a conversation that had been going on since before Harry arrived, Molly at the stove producing a dinner that smelled like it was apologizing in advance for how good it was going to be. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he'd stood in the doorway of the kitchen on his first morning, and looked at all of it. Different this time. Not the astonishment of a first sight. Something more settled. The recognition he described to Ginny on the garden wall, not surprise but familiarity, the feeling of a thing resolving into its own proper shape. He sat down. He ate dinner. He argued with Fred about whether the swamp frog was the same frog every time or whether the charm generated a new frog, which was philosophically interesting enough that Percy got involved despite himself, and the argument became genuinely absorbing and unresolved, which was the best kind. He helped Molly clear the plates, which he'd started doing in the second week without anyone asking, because it was the sort of thing that needed doing and he was there. Arthur winked at him from across the kitchen when he noticed, the approving quiet wink of a man who was pleased by competence. After dinner, Ron challenged him to a final chess game, and Harry sat across the board with the patience he'd been building all summer and played the game all the way to the end and lost by 2 moves, which Ron would talk about for the rest of the journey to Hogwarts and possibly longer. Harry didn't mind. He'd been 3 moves ahead the whole way and had chosen the wrong response to a situation he hadn't seen coming, and that was instructive. Useful. He filed it. He went to bed late, later than he should have, because the house was warm and nobody enforced a bedtime when it was the last night before term and the evening was good. He lay in the camp bed in Ron's room and looked at the ceiling, the low side and the high side and the Quidditch poster directly above him, and he breathed in the particular combination of summer and old wood and beeswax and something faintly magical that was specifically the Burrows air, and he let himself know that he was going to carry this smell with him back to the dormitory and back to Hogwarts, and that it would be there when he needed it. He thought about Amelia Bones's file. Potter, H., Welfare and Guardianship. Resolved. Pending review. Watch this one. He thought about what it meant to be watched in that way, not the managed observation of Dumbledore, not the cautious distance of the wizarding world treating him like an unexploded thing, but the watching of someone who had looked directly and seen something worth the attention. He thought, watch this space. He thought it with the specific quality of someone who was no longer making it small, no longer fitting it into the available dimensions of other people's expectations. He slept. In the morning Molly made a breakfast that was, by general consensus, the largest and best breakfast in the history of the Burrows kitchen, which was a serious claim. Harry ate steadily and without ceremony, and she watched him eat in the warm quiet way she developed, and he looked up and caught her watching and she didn't look away, and he nodded once, very slightly, in the way that meant I know. I'm here. I know. She nodded back. Platform 9 3/4 was chaos in the specific way of September 1st, owls and cats and trunks and parents and the scarlet steam of the Hogwarts Express and the smell of coal and magic and something sweet from the trolley already loading. Harry pushed his trunk through the barrier and stood on the platform and felt it all arrive around him and breathed. Arthur shook his hand. Percy shook his hand. The twins gave him a joint 2-shouldered embrace that nearly knocked him off his feet and which they clearly considered a dignified goodbye. Ron was already heaving his trunk toward the train and calling back instructions about the compartment. Ginny was the last. She was staying behind, second year for her wasn't until next year, and she stood on the platform with her hair in a plait and her hands in her pockets and looked at him with the direct, measuring look she'd had since the night he arrived. Right, she said. Obviously, he said. Not just to Ron. To me. Obviously, he said again. She almost smiled. She was composed, he thought, and felt the same private warmth the twins apparently felt about that word. You're going to have a good year, she said. It was not a prediction. It was the tone of someone stating a thing they intended to make true. Working on it, he said. You're already working on it, she said. That's how I know. He picked up his trunk handle. He looked at her for a moment, at the girl who had sat next to him on the garden wall twice and told him things straight and not needed anything in return for it. He thought about what she'd said, I think that's true, when he talked about Lily's magic being in him, and how she'd said it like it was enough. See you at Christmas, he said. I'll tell the frog you said goodbye, she said. He laughed and got on the train. He found a compartment with Ron and settled in with his trunk above and Hedwig in her cage at his feet and the platform moving past the window as the train began to pull away. He watched the station go, watched the Weasley family get smaller, Arthur's arm around Molly's shoulder, Fred and George already vanishing into the corridor of the train, Ginny on the platform in the clearing smoke of the engine's departure, not waving, just watching, standing entirely still and absolutely present the way she was. He watched until she was gone from the window. Ron was already talking, something about Quidditch predictions for the year, the Gryffindor lineup, whether they could get the pitch twice a week for practice, and Harry listened with one ear and kept the other on the rhythm of the train, the sound of it settling into its own momentum, the specific speed of a journey towards something. He opened one of his notebooks, the new ones, his own, and wrote at the top of the first page, Year 2. Starting from the burrow. He thought about that for a moment, the 6 words on the fresh page, and then he added 2 more, home first. He looked at it. He closed the notebook. Outside the window, England moved past in green and gold and the train ran on through the countryside in the excellent, purposeful way of a thing that knew where it was going, and Harry Potter sat inside it going forward with his warrant in his trunk and his statement on record and his notebooks new and his clothes the right size, and he was not afraid of what was coming. He was, in fact, looking forward to it. And somewhere in the Ministry of Magic, on the second level, at the far end of a corridor lined with tall filing cabinets, Amelia Bones set a very thick folder in her top drawer and wrote on the tab in her careful, precise hand, Potter, H, Welfare and Guardianship. Beneath that, Resolved. Beneath that, Pending Review. And beneath that, in slightly darker ink, added after a moment's consideration, Watch this one. She closed the drawer. She picked up the next file. She got back to work.